I found fresh mud on my pillow and a handprint on the sheet next to where I sleep. I noticed the mud first because I'd just washed the pillowcase. That's the detail that made it impossible to dismiss. I'd done laundry the night before, stripped the bed completely, put everything through a full cycle, and remade it before I went to sleep because I am the kind of person who cannot get into an unmade bed, who finds clean sheets one of the small, non-negotiable pleasures of an otherwise unremarkable week. I had remade that bed at 10:30 p.m., with fresh pillowcases still warm from the dryer. I'd gotten into it at 11. I'd woken up at 6:45 to my alarm and reached over to turn it off, and my hand had come down on something that was not cotton. I sat up and looked at it for a long time before I touched it again. Mud. A smear of it, dark and dense, the color of the soil in the garden beds along the back of my building after rain. Still damp, not wet, not fresh in the way of something deposited minutes ago, but not dried either, not the crumbling, desiccated residue of something tracked in accidentally. The kind of damp that said hours, not days, the kind that said overnight. It was on the pillow I hadn't slept on, the left side of the bed. My side is the right. I got out of bed the way you get out of cars after accidents, carefully, with the stunned precision of someone whose body is moving on autopilot while the mind is still trying to catch up. I stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the full picture, and that was when I saw the handprint on the sheet. Left side, below where the mud was, at approximately the position a person's hand would rest if they were lying on their side facing me. The fingers were pointing toward my side of the bed. The print was partial, heel of the palm and the lower 3 fingers, the kind of impression a hand makes when it's bearing weight rather than pressing deliberately. The kind of print that is left not by someone touching a surface, but by someone resting on it. Someone had been lying in my bed, on the side I don't sleep on. At some point during the night, while I was asleep 18 inches away, I stood at the foot of the bed in my pajamas in the gray 6:45 light and breathed through the specific nausea of that understanding. My apartment is on the 2nd floor of a building in Portland, a mid-sized city, nothing particularly rural, a neighborhood of older houses converted to rentals and young professionals and coffee shops. I had lived there for 8 months. I had a deadbolt and a chain lock and a window that I kept latched. I was a single woman, 31 years old, living alone. I had taken the standard inventory of precautions that women living alone take, and I had felt not safe exactly, but adequately defended. I looked at the handprint on my clean sheet and felt that inventory of precautions become worthless in real time. I checked the locks first. Deadbolt engaged, chain on, exactly as I'd left them. I went through every room, bathroom, kitchen, the small second room I used as an office, opening closets, checking behind the shower curtain, doing the full accounting that your body demands even when your brain is fairly certain of the result. Nothing. No one. The apartment empty and ordinary in the early morning light, except for my bedroom, which was neither of those things. The window above the bed was latched from the inside. The window in the office was latched. The kitchen window was latched. I stood in the middle of my own apartment that I had just searched entirely and could find no way into, and tried to build a version of events that explained what was on my bed. I could not build it. I called my friend Dara, the closest person geographically and the one most likely to answer at 6:50 in the morning, which she did on the second ring with the alertness of someone who had been awake already. I told her what I'd found. She was at my door in 14 minutes, which told me she'd taken me seriously enough to drive faster than she should have. She stood at the foot of my bed and looked at it the same way I had, that long, processing silence. Then she crouched down and looked at the handprint from the side, at the angle that showed the slight compression in the fabric. "That's not a child," she said. I knew that. I'd known that from the size of it. But hearing it said out loud by someone else in the clear light of a Tuesday morning made the floor feel briefly unreliable beneath my feet. The locks were all on, I said. She stood up, looked at me. All of them. All of them. Exactly as I left them. We stood in my bedroom in silence for a moment, the two of us, and the mud sat on my clean pillowcase, and the handprint sat on my clean sheet, and the apartment sat locked around us, and none of it resolved into anything that made sense. "Okay," Dara said finally, with the deliberateness of someone deciding to be practical because the alternative was not useful. "Show me every window in this place, every single one." I showed her every window. They were all latched. Dara stood in my kitchen with her arms crossed and her jaw set and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You're staying at mine tonight." I didn't argue. But before I left, I took my phone and photographed the mud and the handprint from 4 different angles in the morning light. The way you document something you're not sure you'll be believed about, and are not entirely sure you believe yourself. The mud was real. The print was real. The locks had all been on. One of those 3 facts had to give way to the other 2. I spent the next 3 weeks trying to figure out which one. I stayed at Dara's for 2 nights. Long enough to sleep, long enough to stop feeling the specific physical wrongness of my own skin that had settled over me standing at the foot of that bed Tuesday morning. On Thursday, I went back to my apartment because I had a job and a life, and because I was not willing to be displaced from my own space by something I didn't yet understand. I changed the locks first. A locksmith came Thursday afternoon and replaced the deadbolt with a higher-grade cylinder and added a secondary lock to the bedroom door that I hadn't had before. He was a compact, businesslike man named Ray, who asked no questions about why I wanted it done, and charged me $240 and left me with 3 new keys and a receipt. I stood in my bedroom doorway after he'd gone and looked at the new hardware and felt something that was not quite reassurance, but was at least its functional substitute. I also bought a door-stop alarm for the bedroom, the kind that wedges under the door and screams at 120 decibels if the door moves. I tested it once in the hallway, and my downstairs neighbor knocked on my ceiling with what I interpreted as displeasure. I left it in place anyway. I began sleeping with my phone on the nightstand with a camera facing the room. Not a formal setup, just the phone propped against the lamp, recording, the way I'd done it reflexively without examining the instinct too closely. I watched the footage each morning. 7 hours of dark room, ambient street light through the curtains, the occasional car passing outside. Nothing. No one. Just me in my bed on the right side, sleeping in the unremarkable way of a person who had taken every available precaution and was going to sleep anyway because the alternative was not living her life. The mud did not reappear that first week, or the second. By the end of the second week, I had begun the slow, guilty process of wondering whether I had somehow done it myself. Sleepwalking. I'd never done it as an adult, but I'd apparently done it briefly as a child, according to my mother, and stress was a known trigger. The breakup had been 6 months ago, but its reverberations were still moving through my life in ways I was still mapping. Maybe I'd gone outside in my sleep. Maybe I'd come back in and reset the locks from habit without waking. Maybe my sleeping body had lain on the left side of the bed and pressed a palm into the sheet, and I had no memory of any of it. I knew this theory had problems. The chain lock, for one. You cannot put a chain lock on from outside a door. But I pressed on it anyway because it was the only exit that didn't require me to accept something I had no framework for. I mentioned the sleepwalking theory to my doctor at a scheduled appointment. She was a calm, thorough woman named Dr. Oyalaran, who listened to the full account without expression and asked several careful questions. She referred me to a sleep study. I went. They wired me up in a clinic room and monitored me for a single night, and I did not sleepwalk, did not move significantly, did not do anything except sleep in the shallow, self-conscious way you sleep when you know you're being observed. The technician told me the results were unremarkable. Dr. Oyalaran told me the study didn't definitively rule out isolated sleepwalking events, but that there was no physiological indicator that made them likely, unremarkable. The second time in these few weeks that word had been applied to a situation it did not fit. The mud came back on a Thursday night in the third week. I know it was Thursday because I'd had dinner with Dara that evening. Thai food, a bottle of wine split between us. The kind of easy evening that had made me feel genuinely normal for 3 hours. I'd come home at 10:30, locked up with the new locks, wedged the doorstop under the bedroom door, propped the phone on the nightstand, gotten into my clean bed. I was changing the sheets twice a week by then, a compulsion I'd developed without quite deciding to, and gone to sleep. My alarm went off at 6:45. I reached for my phone to turn it off, and my hand went through the recording to check the footage first, the habit of 3 weeks overriding everything else. I found it at 3:08 a.m. The footage showed my bedroom, dark, the ambient light from the street doing its faint gray work through the curtains. I was asleep on my side, right side of the bed, facing the camera. The left side of the bed was visible and empty. At 3:08, the curtain moved. Not significantly. A breath of movement, a shift in the fabric, there and gone in 2 seconds. I watched it 3 times to confirm it wasn't a trick of the compression artifacts and the night vision footage. It wasn't. The curtain moved. I got up and went to the window, latched from the inside. I unlatched it and pushed it open and leaned out into the November morning and looked at the exterior wall below and the narrow ledge that ran along the building's second floor and the ground 10 feet below. The ledge was 4 inches wide. It ran the full length of the building, a decorative architectural feature of a 90-year-old structure that had no practical function except to interrupt the exterior surface. The ledge outside my bedroom window was muddy. Not uniformly, not the way a surface gets muddy from rain or general exposure. In 2 places, evenly spaced, at the width of a person's feet, 2 footprints, side by side, pressed into the grime on a 4-inch ledge on the exterior of my second-floor apartment, pointing toward my window. I stood at the open window in the cold morning air and looked at them, and felt the sleepwalking theory dissolve entirely, and every other comfortable explanation with it. Someone had been standing on the ledge outside my bedroom window at 3:08 in the morning, while I slept 18 inches away on the other side of the glass. I called the police at 6:55 in the morning, still standing at the open window with the cold coming in. I want to tell you they were helpful. They were not unhelpful. That's the most accurate way I can put it. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, a man and a woman, both of them professional and thorough in the way of people performing a function rather than engaging with a situation. They looked at the footage. They looked at the footprints on the ledge. They walked the perimeter of the building. The female officer, whose name was Reyes, stood on the ground below my window and looked up at the ledge for a long moment with an expression I couldn't read from where I was standing. She came back upstairs and told me the ledge was accessible from a drain pipe at the building's rear corner. Someone who was reasonably fit and motivated could have climbed the drain pipe to the ledge and moved along it to my window. It was not an easy route, she said. It would have required intention. I asked whether that same route would have allowed someone to enter the apartment. She looked at me carefully. Your window was latched. The first time there was mud on the bed, all the windows were latched too. She and her partner exchanged a brief look that I was meant to interpret as professional neutrality, and that I interpreted instead as the look of 2 people deciding how much weight to assign something that doesn't fit neatly into their report template. She took my statement. She gave me a case number. She told me to document everything, to consider a security camera, and that they would increase patrols in the area. She also told me at the door that the first incident, the mud and the handprint, could not be conclusively linked to an intruder without evidence of forced entry, and that without forced entry it was difficult to pursue formally. I closed the door behind them and stood in my hallway and thought about the word conclusively. and how much damage it could do when applied to something you had lived inside of. I bought 2 cameras that afternoon, one for the exterior of the building, aimed at the drain pipe and the rear corner, and one for inside my bedroom, a proper mounted unit with night vision and motion activation rather than my phone propped against a lamp. I installed them myself with instructions from a video online, and with the grim, focused energy of a person who has decided that being frightened is acceptable, but being passive is not. I also called my building manager, a largely absent man named Garrett, who communicated primarily by email, and who I had met exactly once. I called, rather than emailed, because I needed a response faster than his usual 3 to 5 business day turnaround. I told him what had happened. I told him about the footprints. I told him about the drain pipe access to the second-floor ledge, and said that the building had a liability issue if tenants were accessible via an unsecured climbing route on the exterior. The word liability produced Garrett in person within 2 hours, which told me everything about his actual priorities. He inspected the drain pipe. He inspected the ledge. He stood on the ground and looked up with the same unreadable expression Reyes had used. "I can put a collar on the drain pipe," he said. "Metal sleeve below the second floor. Makes it unclimbable. Please do that today." He did it that afternoon. I watched from my window. A maintenance worker bolted a smooth metal sleeve around the drain pipe at the 8-foot mark, too high to reach by jumping, too smooth to grip above, and it took 45 minutes and made the climbing route impassable. I stood at the window and watched until it was done, and felt something I was careful not to identify as relief, because relief implied the problem was solved, and I was not yet sure it was. That night I checked the new camera feed 3 times before I went to sleep. Watched the rear corner of the building, the drain pipe with its new collar gleaming dully in the ambient light. Nothing moved. I went to bed at 11 with the doorstop wedged and the new bedroom lock engaged, and the cameras running, and woke at 6:45 to an alarm I turned off before I checked the footage. The exterior camera showed nothing. The drain pipe undisturbed, the ledge empty, the rear corner of the building quiet for the full 8 hours. The bedroom camera showed me sleeping. Right side of the bed, the left side empty. Streetlight through the curtains, the familiar ambient gray of a room at night. Unremarkable footage in every sense, except at 2:51 a.m., the motion sensor had triggered. I went to the timestamp with my heart already going and watched the footage from there. The room looked exactly the same. I was asleep, slightly shifted from my earlier position, the left side of the bed still empty. Nothing visible in the frame had changed enough to trigger the sensor. I watched it 4 times before I found it. The curtain, left side. Not the breadth of movement I'd seen in the phone footage. Something slower than that, more sustained. A slight but continuous pressure against the fabric from the window side, held for perhaps 30 seconds, as though something on the other side of the glass was resting its weight against it. Window latched, metal collar on the drain pipe, ledge empty on the exterior camera, and something pressing against my bedroom curtain from outside at 2:51 a.m. I sat on the edge of my bed in the early morning with the footage paused on the curtain and tried to build the rational architecture the way I always did, and found that the materials I had available no longer assembled into anything load-bearing. The drain pipe was blocked. The ledge had been empty on camera. Every window in the apartment was latched, and yet the curtain moved the way curtains move when there is a presence on the other side of them. I called Dara, told her about the footage. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's the same night of the week," she said. "What?" "The first mud. That was a Thursday night." "What night was the curtain movement on the phone footage?" I checked. "Thursday." "What night is tonight?" "Thursday." I looked at the date. 3 weeks to the day from the first incident. 2 weeks to the day from the second. A Thursday night interval, regular as a calendar entry, precise as a pattern that had been running long enough to be certain of itself. Whatever this was, it had a schedule, and it had kept it while I was sleeping 3 feet away, every single time, without waking me once. I thought about that, about the specific restraint of it, the choice, if it was a choice, to watch rather than to act, to press against a curtain rather than to push through it, to lie in the space beside me and leave mud on a pillow and rise and go before the alarm went off. I thought about whether restraint was comforting or whether it was the most frightening thing about the whole situation. I decided it was the latter, because restraint implied patience, and patience implied that whatever this was, it was in no particular hurry. The following Thursday, I did not go to sleep. I made that decision on Friday morning after I hung up with Dara, and I spent the week preparing for it the way you prepare for something you are dreading and cannot avoid. Practically, methodically, with the specific focus of a person who has decided that action is less frightening than waiting. I bought a motion-activated floodlight for the exterior rear corner and had Garrett install it that Tuesday, aimed at the drain pipe and the ledge. I charged both cameras fully and tested the motion sensitivity. I bought a personal alarm, the kind that pulls to emit a sustained shriek, and put it on the nightstand next to my phone. I told Dara the plan. She wanted to come over, and I told her no, not because I didn't want her there, but because I needed to see what happened when the variables were the same as they'd been the previous 3 weeks. One person in the apartment, bedroom door locked, windows latched, cameras running, Thursday night. I needed to see it. I went to bed at the normal time, lay in the dark in my normal position on the right side of the bed, and looked at the ceiling and watched the minutes on my phone move through 10, 11, midnight. The apartment was quiet around me. The floodlight outside threw a faint glow at the edge of the curtain, not enough to light the room, but enough that the window was no longer fully dark, a pale rectangle in the wall like a dim screen. 1 a.m. The building settled around me. A car passed on the street. 2 a.m. My eyes were heavy in the way eyes get when you are demanding wakefulness from a body that has its own schedule and its own priorities. I sat up, turned on the lamp briefly, drank water, turned it off, lay back down. 2:30. The curtain was still. The floodlight edge held its pale position. Nothing moved. 2:51 came and went without incident, and something in my chest unwound slightly. Irrational, I knew that. A pattern of 3 data points was not a guarantee, and I'd told myself that repeatedly. But the specific minute passing without the curtain shifting felt like exhaling. At 3:04, the floodlight outside triggered. The pale edge at the curtain went blazing white. Full activation. The motion sensor doing exactly what I'd bought it to do, flooding the rear corner of the building with harsh LED light. I was upright before I'd finished registering what had happened, phone in hand, pulling up the exterior camera feed. The drain pipe, the ledge, the rear corner of the building in sharp, overexposed light. Nothing there. The ledge empty, the drain pipe collar intact, the ground below undisturbed. Whatever had triggered the sensor had moved through the camera's frame too quickly, or from an angle it hadn't captured, or had triggered the motion sensor from outside the camera's view. The light ran its 30-second cycle and went off, and the rear corner went back to dark. I sat in my bed with the camera feed still open, and my heart going very fast, and I watched. At 3:07, the bedroom curtain moved. The same sustained pressure from the footage. Not a breath, not a draft. Something with weight and intention pressing against the fabric from the window side. I was looking directly at it this time, not watching it on a screen the morning after, looking at it in real time, the curtain 2 feet from my face, the window behind it latched, and the ledge outside empty on camera, and the floodlight not triggering again. I did not move. I am aware this sounds like the wrong decision, and I cannot fully explain it except to say that my body locked in the particular way bodies lock when they are receiving more information than they know how to act on. I sat in my bed, and I watched the curtain press inward with the slow, steady weight of something resting against the glass, and I breathed, and did not reach for the alarm, and did not scream. The pressure held for what my phone later told me was 47 seconds. Then it released. The curtain fell back to its normal hang. The exterior camera showed nothing. The floodlight did not trigger again. I sat in the silence that followed for a long time. Then I got up and unlocked the bedroom door and went to the kitchen and turned on every light and called Dara at 3:15 in the morning and talked to her for an hour while sitting on my kitchen counter with my back against the cabinet and my eyes on the hallway. She came over at 4:30. We sat in my kitchen until dawn, and I showed her the footage, and we watched the curtain move together on my laptop screen. And neither of us said much because there wasn't much to say that the footage hadn't already said more clearly. At 7 in the morning, in the full daylight, I went back to my bedroom. The left side of the bed was undisturbed. No mud, no handprint, nothing. The window was latched from the inside the way I had left it. The floodlight was intact, the camera was intact, the new locks were intact. Every precaution I had taken was in the exact state I'd left it. But on the windowsill, the interior sill, the painted wooden ledge inside the glass, there was a smear of mud. Not much. A partial streak, the width of several fingers pressed together at the lower left corner of the sill. Not visible from the bed. I only found it because I was standing directly in front of the window in the daylight, looking for exactly this kind of thing. The window was latched, had been latched all night. I had not opened it. I stood there looking at the mud on the inside of a latched window in the full, honest light of a Friday morning, and understood that the drain pipe collar and the floodlight and the cameras and the new locks had not addressed the actual problem. That the actual problem was something I did not have the right tools for. That I had been measuring and documenting and securing against a thing that did not appear to require any of the routes I'd been blocking. I took a photograph of the mud on the sill. I stood there in the morning light and I thought about 4 Thursdays, about something that had kept a schedule with the reliability of a person who had somewhere to be and always showed up, about restraint and patience and the specific quality of attention required to lie beside someone sleeping and leave only the lightest possible evidence of having been there. I thought about what it wanted. I did not have an answer. I was beginning to think the answer was the most frightening part of all. I moved out of the apartment on a Wednesday, one day before the 5th Thursday, and I have not been back. I want to be honest about the financial reality of that decision because I think it matters. Breaking the lease cost me 3 months' rent. I had just replaced the deadbolt and bought 2 cameras and a floodlight and a personal alarm, none of which I could take with me in any meaningful sense. I had a savings account that existed for emergencies, and I spent most of it on the logistics of leaving quickly. And I would spend it again without hesitation. And I think that tells you everything necessary about where I was by the time I made the call. Garrett took it better than I expected. I think he'd been anticipating it. When I called him Wednesday morning and told him I was breaking the lease, he was quiet for a moment and then asked, with the careful neutrality of a man choosing not to say what he already knew, whether there had been a problem with the unit. I told him there had been a security concern that had not been adequately resolved. He said he understood. He said he'd be in touch about the deposit. Neither of us mentioned the Thursday nights or the mud or the cameras or any of it. And I've thought about that silence since, about what it means that a building manager accepts a broken lease from a tenant 8 months in without asking a single follow-up question. I think Garrett knew more about that apartment than he had said to me. I think he had known when he rented it to me, and I think the slightly below market rate I'd been paying, which I had attributed to the building's age and the neighborhood, was something closer to compensation. A discount applied for a known condition. the way you mark down a car with a history. I didn't confront him about it. I needed the deposit back more than I needed the conversation. I'm in a different apartment now, across the city, newer building, 4th floor. I've been here for 6 weeks. I chose the 4th floor deliberately, which I am aware is a gesture without logical basis given what I experienced, because whatever came to my window on Verdun Street was doing things that a 4th floor elevation doesn't prevent. I did it anyway. It was what my nervous system needed, and I have stopped requiring my nervous system to be rational about this. The Thursdays are the hardest part to live with. Not the mud, or the handprint, or the curtain, or the mud on the inside of the latched window. Those are the events, and events have edges, and I can locate them in time and place and hold them at a certain distance. The Thursdays are different. Thursdays have kept coming, one after another, 7 of them now since I left Verdun Street, and each one I am awake for whether I intend to be or not. My body has learned the day and made it a vigil, and I lie in my bed on the 4th floor in the new building with the city sounds coming up from below, and I watch the ceiling and I wait for nothing I can name, and usually nothing happens, and I am aware that usually is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. 4 weeks after I moved out, I went back to Verdun Street once. Not inside. I no longer had a key and didn't want one. I stood on the sidewalk across the street in the middle of the afternoon and looked up at the 2nd floor windows. My old bedroom window was visible from there, the white curtain I'd left behind still hanging inside it. The building looked entirely ordinary in the November afternoon light, old and slightly tired, and full of the history of a structure that had been housing human lives for nearly a century. The window was dark. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the window was dark in the way a room is dark when nobody has turned on a light in it for a while. I stood there longer than I'd intended to, looking at the window and thinking about what was on the other side of it on Thursday nights. Whether it still went there, whether it stood on the empty side of an empty bed in the dark and kept its appointment with a person who was no longer there to keep it with. Whether it had followed me the way Gerald Maurer's warmth had followed that consultant to her new hotel and eventually home, or whether it was fixed to the apartment on Verdun Street the way Robert Harlan's grief had been fixed to a house in a quiet suburb. I don't know. I have no way to know. What I know is this. On my 6th Thursday in the new apartment, I woke at 3 a.m. without an alarm and lay in the dark listening to the building around me and felt, for a period of perhaps 2 minutes, a warmth on the left side of the bed that had no source I could account for. Not the warmth of blankets or trapped body heat or a room running slightly hot. The other kind. The kind I had come to know over 4 consecutive Thursdays as the warmth of an occupied space. It was gone before I finished identifying it. By the time I turned on the lamp, the left side of the bed was cool and ordinary and entirely empty. I lay there in the lamplight for a while, and then I turned it off and lay in the dark, and eventually went back to sleep. In the morning, I checked the pillowcase on the left side. I checked it carefully in the full daylight, running my hand over the entire surface. Nothing. Clean fabric, smooth and undisturbed, and exactly as I'd put it on the night before. I checked the sheet beside me. Nothing. I put the kettle on and stood in my kitchen in the early morning and made coffee and told myself it had been a dream, a hypnagogic hallucination, a trauma response playing out in the warm dark of a room where nothing had actually happened. I've mostly managed to believe that. But I change the sheets every week now, twice if I've had a bad Thursday, and I sleep on the right side of every bed I am ever in. I do not think I will ever again be able to sleep on the left. I pulled back my shower curtain and found a damp towel. I hadn't showered in 3 days. It was folded. That was the detail that stopped me, not the dampness. Damp could have been anything, condensation, a slow leak from the showerhead fitting that the landlord had been ignoring since August. But a damp towel folded neatly over the curtain rod in my own bathroom, draped with the precise halved and halved again geometry of someone who folds towels out of habit rather than intention. That was not condensation. That was not a leak. That was a person. I stood in the bathroom doorway in my socks, and I looked at it for a long time. The towel was mine. Dark green. One of a set of 4 I'd bought at a department store 2 years ago, currently stored in the linen closet at the end of the hall. I knew without checking that the closet would show 3 remaining because the 4th was here, on my shower rod, still carrying the faint weight of recent moisture. It had been used within hours, maybe less. I should tell you where I was in my life when this happened, because it matters for understanding how I almost didn't notice. My mother had died in February. By April, which is when this happened, I had settled into the specific, low-ceilinged existence that deep grief produces in some people, a state less like sadness and more like an interruption of all ordinary function. I was working from home, which meant I was technically present at my laptop for 8 hours a day and actually present for perhaps 2 of them. I was eating in ways that could charitably be described as utilitarian. I was sleeping at irregular hours and waking from dreams I didn't remember with the residual feeling of having been somewhere I couldn't find my way back from. And I was not, as the title of this story accurately states, showering with any regularity. Not out of neglect exactly, more out of the profound motivational deficit that grief installs, the way it makes the distance between where you are and the bathroom feel longer than it has any right to be. I had last showered on a Tuesday. This was Friday. 3 days of avoidance that I would have been mildly embarrassed about under normal circumstances, and that under these circumstances I had simply noted and set aside. The apartment was mine alone. I had no partner, no roommate, no regular visitor who might have let themselves in with a spare key I'd forgotten I'd given out. My closest friend Nadia lived 40 minutes away and had a key for emergencies. She'd used it twice, both times with a text in advance. My super had building access, but had not been in, as far as I knew, since the radiator repair in January. I turned around and looked at the front door, both locks engaged, the chain on. I had not left the apartment since Wednesday, a pharmacy run, 40 minutes out and back, during which I had locked everything behind me with the methodical paranoia that living alone in a city eventually installs in you. I had been in this apartment continuously for 48 hours since Wednesday, and in that time, I had not opened the door to anyone, and I had not used the shower, and the towel folded over the curtain rod was damp. The arithmetic of those facts was not complicated. I pulled the bathroom door shut from the outside, an instinct, the body's logic of putting a barrier between itself and a thing it hasn't classified yet, and I stood in the hallway, and I held the closed door's handle in my hand, and I tried to think clearly through the specific cotton wool thickness that grief had installed in my thinking over the past 2 months. Someone had been in my apartment, had used my shower, had used my towel, had folded it with the automatic neatness of a person completing a routine, the way you fold a towel in a space you are comfortable in a space that feels, to you, like yours, and had left, or was still here. I did not check. I want to be honest about that. The thought of opening a door, any door, the closet, the bedroom, and finding the answer to that question was something my body refused before my mind could weigh in on it. I went to the kitchen instead, because the kitchen was the farthest point from every closable door in the apartment, and I sat down on the floor with my back against the cabinets, and I called Nadia. She answered on the first ring. "I need you to come over," I said. "Something is wrong and I can't. I need you here." A pause so brief it barely existed. "I'm getting my keys." She arrived in 38 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my phone the entire time, sitting on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and my eyes on the hallway. The bathroom door was still closed. Everything else in the apartment was exactly as I'd left it, the laptop open on the coffee table, the half-eaten bowl of cereal I'd made at some point that morning and forgotten, the bedroom door standing open the way I always left it. Normal. Unchanged. The apartment doing its best impression of a place where nothing had happened. I had not moved from the kitchen floor. I'm not proud of that, and I'm also not going to pretend it was a rational decision, because it wasn't a decision at all. It was simply what my body was doing, and my body was not, in that period, particularly interested in my input. Nadia knocked twice and said my name, and I let her in, and she looked at my face and didn't ask any questions, just put both hands on my shoulders and said, "Okay," and I showed her the bathroom. She looked at the towel for a long moment, then she turned to me. "This is yours." "Dark green. Department store. 2 years ago. I have 4. I checked the linen closet." She checked it anyway, which I didn't take personally. 3 remaining neatly stacked, exactly where they should be. She came back to the bathroom and looked at the towel again and reached out and touched the edge of it, testing the dampness herself, measuring it with her fingertips. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture did, a barely perceptible shift in the set of her shoulders. "When did you last go in here?" she said. "Wednesday morning, possibly Tuesday night. I don't remember exactly." She looked at me, and I could see her accounting for the grief and the fog and the motivational deficit that she knew about and had been carefully not commenting on for 2 months. "So this wasn't here Wednesday morning?" "No, I would have seen it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to check the apartment." "Nadia, I'm going to check it," she said, in the tone she uses when something has been decided and discussion is a formality. "You stay in the kitchen. Leave the door open so you can see me the whole time." I went back to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and watched her. She was methodical and unhurried. Closets, under the bed, behind the door in the second room I used for storage, the narrow space beside the washing machine, the bathroom cabinet. She did not rush, and she did not perform nervousness for my benefit, and she came back to the kitchen 6 minutes later and said no one was there. "The windows," I said. "Were any of them?" "All locked. I checked." She came and stood in front of me and put a hand on the side of my face the way you do with someone you've known for a long time. "You're okay. No one is here right now. Right now." I noticed the qualifier, and I could tell she noticed that I noticed it. We sat at the kitchen table, and I made tea because it was something to do with my hands, and Nadia sat across from me, and we looked at the problem from its available angles. Entry points. The front door, which showed no signs of forced entry and which I had chained from the inside. The windows, locked from the inside, none of them showing damage. The fire escape window in the second room, which also locked from inside, and which I checked myself while the kettle boiled, pressing my face to the glass to look at the exterior latch. It was latched. It had been latched. But the paint around the frame was disturbed. Not freshly so, not dramatically, but in the way of a surface that has been contacted repeatedly over time, the paint at the edges of the casement showing thin compression marks that the rest of the window frame didn't show. I called Nadia over. She looked, said nothing for a moment. Then, "That could be old." "It could be." We looked at each other. The thing about the fire escape window was that it opened from the inside by lifting a latch, which meant that from the outside, with the right tool and enough patience, the latch could conceivably be manipulated through the gap in the casement. The window was old, original to the building, which had been constructed in the late 60s, and its tolerances were not precise. There was, if you looked at it as a problem to be solved rather than a window to be admired, a gap. I had never looked at it as a problem to be solved. I had looked at it as a window with a latch and assumed that was sufficient and moved on, the way you do with the security features of a place you've lived in for 2 years without incident. "How long have you been in this apartment?" Nadia said. 2 years in June. "And before your mom, were you home this much, this consistently?" I understood what she was asking. Before February, I had kept a normal schedule. Office 3 days a week, evenings out occasionally, weekends that sometimes took me away for a night or two. Before February, there had been regular periods of vacancy, regular windows of opportunity for someone who had identified the window as a problem to be solved and had begun solving it. The tea had gone cold while we talked. I looked at it and thought about the 2 months since my mother died and the particular inwardness of that period. the way I had drawn the apartment around me like a shell and rarely emerged from it, and I thought about whether that inwardness had accidentally protected me from something by keeping the apartment occupied and warm and lit at hours when it previously would have been dark and empty, or whether it had simply meant I was always there, always present, always sleeping in the next room or eating at this table, or sitting on the kitchen floor in the dark after a phone call that had gone badly. Always 12 feet from a bathroom where someone had stood under the water that came out of my shower head and used the towel from my linen closet and folded it with the automatic neatness of someone who has done this before. The thought was not theoretical. It had happened. The dampness was evidence. "I need to call the police," I said. Nadia had her phone out before I finished the sentence. 2 officers came, a man and a woman, both younger than I expected, both with the professionally neutral expressions of people who have learned to withhold assessment until the facts are in front of them. The woman, Officer Tran, her name tag said, took the lead. She listened to everything I told her without writing anything down at first, just listening with the quality of attention that makes you feel both taken seriously and slightly exposed. When I finished, she asked me to walk her through the apartment in the order I'd moved through it that morning, and I did. And she looked at each thing I showed her with the same steady consideration. The bathroom, the towel, the linen closet, the fire escape window with its compression marks in the paint. She looked at the window for a long time, crouched and examined the frame at the base of the casement, produced a small flashlight and angled it along the interior sill. "Has the super been in recently?" she said. "Not since January. The radiator. Anyone else with access? Family, friends, previous partner?" "Nadia." I nodded at Nadia, standing in the doorway. "She has a key for emergencies. She used it once in November, once in December. Both times, she texted first." Tran made a note. "You said you've been home consistently since your mother passed. How consistently?" The phrasing was careful, and I appreciated it. "I've left for groceries and the pharmacy, maybe 8 times total in 2 months, usually under an hour." She absorbed this. Her partner was moving through the other rooms behind us, quiet and methodical, and I heard him lifting things and replacing them with the particular careful sounds of someone conducting a search who doesn't want to disturb the scene more than necessary. Then he called Tran's name from the second room. His voice had a specific quality to it, not urgent, not alarmed, but altered. The tone of someone who has found something they weren't expecting and are calibrating how to present it. I knew that tone from the way Nadia's posture had shifted at the fire escape window, and my stomach tightened before I'd taken a single step toward the door. He was standing in the middle of the storage room, more accurately the room I used as a storage room. Boxes from the move I'd never fully unpacked, my mother's things I'd brought back after the estate was settled, a clothing rack with the out-of-season items I'd stopped rotating because rotating seasonal clothing required a particular optimism about the future that I hadn't had access to lately. He was standing in the middle of all of that with his flashlight directed at the clothing rack, specifically at the far end of it, the end pushed closest to the wall. I looked where the light was pointed, a sleeping bag, rolled tight and pushed into the angle where the clothing rack met the wall, half obscured by the hem of a winter coat. Dark nylon, compact, the kind designed for backpacking, designed specifically to compress small and take up very little space and be very easy to miss if you were not looking for it. I had not put it there. I did not own a sleeping bag. I had never owned a sleeping bag. Camping was not a thing I did and had never been a thing I did, and there was no version of my history in which that object belonged among my boxes and my mother's things and my out-of-season coats. Tran was beside me. "Is this yours?" The question was a formality. She could see my face. "No," I said. She didn't touch it. Pulled out her radio instead and said something brief and low into it, and her partner stepped back from the rack and gently moved me into the doorway, out of the room, with the quiet authority of someone redirecting you away from a scene before it becomes a scene. I stood in the hallway outside the storage room door and looked at the sleeping bag from across the room and tried to absorb what it meant. Not a one-time intrusion, Not someone who had come in once, used the shower, left. Someone who had been sleeping here, in the room adjacent to my bedroom, separated from where I laid my head at night by a single interior wall, on a sleeping bag they had brought and hidden and returned to on whatever schedule my absence allowed, or in whatever hours of the night they had determined were safe while I was present. The fire escape window with its compression marks, the tolerance gap in the old casement, opened from outside, entered, the window closed behind. All of it while I was home or gone, awake or asleep, sitting on the kitchen floor in the dark or lying in the next room with the grief fog thick around me, completely unaware. How many nights? That was the question I couldn't stop the mind from running at. How many nights had that sleeping bag been unrolled in the corner of my storage room, 8 feet from where I slept, and rolled back up before morning and pushed behind the coats before I woke? How many times had the fire escape window lifted and lowered on its old, imprecise tolerances while I lay in the dark, too weighted with grief to do anything but stare at the ceiling? How many mornings had I made coffee in the kitchen, completely alone, not knowing I wasn't? Nadia's hand found mine in the hallway and held it. I gripped back without looking at her and watched Tran on her radio and felt the apartment I had lived in for 2 years rearranging itself around me into something I didn't recognize. They found more once they knew what they were looking for. Tran's partner, Officer Gable, I learned eventually, went back through every room with the specific attention of someone no longer conducting a general sweep, but looking for the evidence of habitation. The kind of small, embedded details that a person leaves in a space they have occupied repeatedly and grown comfortable in. Things that blend into the background of a lived environment until someone looks at them as anomalies rather than fixtures. Behind the bathroom cabinet mirror, a toothbrush. Not mine, a different brand than I used, blue where mine was white. Pushed to the very back of the shelf behind my things, and not visible unless you fully opened the mirrored door and looked at the back edge of the shelf. I had not fully opened that door in, I thought about it, months. Since the grief set in and the motivational deficit made even the small daily maintenance of a person's life feel laborious. In the kitchen, on the highest shelf of the cabinet above the refrigerator where I kept things I never used, a spare phone charger. Generic, white, micro USB, not mine. I used USB-C and had used USB-C for 3 years, and I had never owned a micro USB charger, had nothing in the apartment it could charge, and whoever had left it there had placed it in the one location in the kitchen least likely to be disturbed by someone living at approximately 2/3 capacity, in the storage room, underneath the sleeping bag when Gable carefully lifted it for examination, a paperback. Creased spine, no bookmark, left open face down on the page where it had been set aside, the way you set a book aside when you intend to come back to it. A thriller I didn't recognize, someone else's name written in pen on the inside cover. Not mine, not anyone's name I knew. Below the name, a date, 2 years and 3 months ago. The sleeping bag had been here longer than I had. I said this out loud, and Tran looked at me, and then looked at Gable, and something moved between them that they didn't put into words. The previous tenant, she said carefully, would need to be looked into. The building management would be contacted about the window maintenance history. She said all of this with the steady procedural even-handedness of someone who understands that information delivered too quickly to a person in shock has a half-life of about 30 seconds, and she paced it accordingly. I sat on the edge of my bed. They had confirmed the bedroom was clear, and Nadia had come and sat beside me with her shoulder against mine, a silent, physical anchor. And I listened to the sounds of the investigation moving through my apartment, and I thought about the name written in the paperback. Someone's name, in pen, on a book they'd been reading in the dark of my storage room, 8 feet from my bed, for over 2 years. Before me, through me. Continuous and uninterrupted by the change in tenancy, because the building management had never identified the window as a problem, and the previous tenant had apparently never reported it, and whatever arrangement had existed before I arrived had simply continued, unchanged, into my occupancy. My occupancy. My grief. My weeks of staying home and staring at the ceiling and leaving the apartment for 40-minute pharmacy runs and coming back and locking the chain and believing I was alone. "Did they come in while I was here?" I asked Tran when she came to the doorway. "Is there any way to know?" She looked at me with that careful measuring consideration. The sleeping bag position and the window wear suggest regular access. We can't determine from the physical evidence alone what hours that access occurred. "The towel," I said. "The towel was damp this morning and I've been home since Wednesday." "Yes." So the answer was yes. They had come in while I was here, present and awake somewhere in the apartment, and had used my shower, my hot water, my towel from the linen closet, with enough confidence and familiarity to do so and fold the result neatly and leave. Had done this and exited through the fire escape window and left me sitting at my kitchen table with cold cereal and grief and no idea. I thought about all the times over the past 2 months I had heard something and attributed it to the building. A shift, a sound I couldn't place, something in the walls or the pipes or the floor above me. My mother had died in February, and by April I was living so deeply inside my own interior weather that the outside world had become a constant ambient hum I no longer parsed carefully. I had stopped listening. Grief had done that, among its other rearrangements. Something had used that. I cannot say whether the timing was deliberate, whether the withdrawal and the distraction had been assessed and exploited, or whether it was simply coincidence, wrong place, wrong condition, wrong window, with the wrong tolerances in the wrong building. I can tell you, it doesn't feel like coincidence. I can tell you that the folded towel had the quality of a thing done without concern for discovery, and that carelessness of that particular kind implies a confidence that has to come from somewhere. Tran gave me a case number and a direct line and told me to stay with Nadia that night. She didn't suggest I could stay in the apartment. Neither of us acknowledged that she didn't suggest it. I took one bag. Nadia carried it to the car. I locked the front door behind me and stood on the landing for a moment and looked at the door and thought about how many times I had stood on the other side of it, believing it kept things out. Then I went downstairs and didn't look back. Nobody was charged. I need to put that first because it is the fact that organizes everything else. The investigation identified a person of interest through the name in the paperback and the building's maintenance records and a prior complaint. One complaint, filed 18 months before I moved in by the tenant 2 floors up, describing a man she'd seen on the fire escapes at odd hours and who had not responded when she called out to him. The complaint had been logged and forwarded to building management, and building management had noted it, and nothing had been changed about the fire escape window on the 2nd floor, or the casement tolerances, or the latch hardware, and the complaint had been filed, and the file had sat. One complaint, 18 months. Nothing changed. The person of interest was interviewed and released. The evidence connecting them specifically to my apartment was, in the language of the detective who called me 6 weeks later, circumstantial. The name in the paperback was common. The sleeping bag had no identifying material. The toothbrush and charger produced no useful forensics. The fire escape window showed access evidence, but not a fingerprint that could be matched with sufficient certainty for charges. The investigation remained open. I knew without being told that open meant stalled, and stalled meant, in all probability, finished. I never went back to that apartment. I had Nadia collect the rest of my things over 2 visits with a friend I'd never met, who turned out to be a quiet, enormous man named Patrick who carried boxes without being asked and refused coffee both times. I paid the lease break fee and moved to a place on the 4th floor with no fire escape access from the exterior and windows that I had professionally inspected before I signed anything. I replaced the windows anyway. The landlord objected. I paid for it myself. I live differently now in ways that I've made a certain peace with. I check window latches before I sleep, all of them, a complete circuit of the apartment, every night without exception. I notice sleeping bags in shop windows and feel my chest tighten in a way that passes after a moment, but does not stop happening. I moved a floor lamp into the storage room of the new place, the kind that makes a space look occupied and inhabited, and I leave it on a timer that runs it through the night. My mother's things are still in boxes in that storage room. I haven't been able to open them. That is a separate grief, and I am working on it separately, and I mention it only because the two things became entangled in me, the loss of her and the violation of the apartment, knotted together in the February through April period in a way that my therapist has helped me begin to unspool. They are not the same wound. They are just wounds that arrived together and learned to refer to each other. What I think about most, in the clear-eyed way of someone who has had enough distance and enough therapy to look at a thing directly, is the folded towel. Not the sleeping bag, not the toothbrush, not the charger on the high shelf. The towel. Because the sleeping bag and the toothbrush and the charger were concealed. They were pushed to the back and tucked behind and placed out of sight with the specific intention of not being found. Someone had thought about discovery and taken precautions against it. The system was working. And then one morning, my particular Friday morning in April, 3 days into an avoidance streak, finally making the distance to the bathroom feel manageable, they left a towel folded on the curtain rod. I have never decided whether that was carelessness or something else, whether the confidence had finally outgrown the caution, whether 2 months of watching me move through that apartment half present and hollowed out by grief had produced a certainty that I would not notice, that I had stopped being someone who looked carefully at her own bathroom. I noticed. That is the thing I return to when the rest of it gets too heavy. The cotton wool grief and the motivational deficit and the 3 days of the wrong kind of stillness that put me in that bathroom on that Friday morning instead of a Tuesday. All of it assembled, without knowing, into the exact moment I needed to be standing in that doorway with my eyes open. I noticed. And then I called Nadia. And then I was not alone anymore. That is enough. It has to be enough. Most days it is. I found scratches on my bedroom floor like something heavy had been dragged from under my bed to the door. I found them because I dropped an earring. Small things change everything. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the scratches themselves, not what came after, but the fact that a $3 hoop earring slipped off the edge of my nightstand at 7 in the morning and rolled under the bed, and I got down on my hands and knees to retrieve it, and that's how I found them. My name is Mara. I was 29, renting a house, a whole house, my first, which felt like an enormous adult accomplishment, and which I had told approximately everyone I knew about, in a small city in western Pennsylvania. A narrow 2-story with original hardwood floors throughout, a landlord who was responsive exactly 50% of the time, and a bedroom at the back of the second floor that I'd spent 3 weekends making feel like mine, area rug curtains, the good lamp from my last apartment, plants on the windowsill that were doing better than plants I owned had any right to do. I'd been there 7 months when I found the scratches. 7 months is long enough to know a floor, long enough to know its sounds, its grain, the way the boards ran, the specific creak of the one closest to the door that I'd stopped noticing by month 2, long enough to have vacuumed under the bed twice and mopped the exposed hardwood around the rug at least a dozen times, long enough that I would have noticed, I am certain, if what I was looking at had been there before. Under the bed, my earring, 2 dust mice I'd missed on the last pass, a library book I'd reported lost and been charged for and had not expected to see again, and the scratches. They ran from a point roughly centered under the bed, dead center, under the middle of the mattress, straight to the edge where the bed frame ended and the open floor began, and then continued across the open hardwood to the base of the bedroom door, maybe 6 feet total, wide enough that whatever made them had been substantial. Not a single gouge, but a series of parallel marks, the kind of pattern left by something broad and heavy being moved in one direction. The wood was lighter along the scratches where the finish had been stripped, bright against the darker aged floor. Not old, not years of accumulated wear. The bright wood meant recent. I sat back on my heels and looked at them. The direction was the thing, from under the bed to the door, not scattered, not random, not the kind of marks furniture makes when you nudge it sideways. A single sustained path, centered, deliberate looking in the way that natural processes never quite look. Start point. Under the middle of my mattress, in the part of the underbed space furthest from either side, the part you couldn't reach without a flashlight or getting fully down on the floor. End point. The bedroom door. I thought about the geometry of it for a moment. Something that started under the center of my bed and ended at the door had traveled toward the exit, away from concealment, toward the rest of the house. I got up off the floor, stood in my bedroom in the early morning light, and looked at the door, which was standing open the way I always left it. I didn't like sleeping with it closed, a habit from childhood, some residual need to hear what was happening in the rest of the house. Open, as it always was. The door opened into the upstairs hallway. The hallway connected to the second bedroom I used for storage, the bathroom, and the top of the stairs. I was aware, in a way that I hadn't been 30 seconds ago, of the quiet in the rest of the house. My phone was on the nightstand. I picked it up, checked the time, 7:14 a.m., and then stood there holding it without calling anyone because what would I say? There are scratches on my floor. I don't know what made them. They go from under my bed to my door. I was asleep 6 feet above them, and I didn't hear anything. I went to the bathroom instead, went through the motions of getting ready for work, shower, coffee, the ordinary machinery of a morning, and I did all of it with the scratches sitting in the back of my mind, like something that hadn't finished arriving yet. On my way out, I stopped at the base of the stairs and looked up at the second floor landing. Quiet. Sunlight through the bathroom window, the dust in it doing what dust does. The door to the storage room closed. My bedroom door open, the rectangle of morning light from my windows laying itself across the hallway floor. And at the edge of that light, just barely visible from where I stood at the bottom of the stairs, the pale bright lines of the scratches, running from the dark under the bed toward me. I went to work. I came home. I did not sleep well. The next morning I got down on the floor again, properly this time, with my phone's flashlight, and measured the depth of the scratches with my fingernail. Not surface level. Not the kind of mark a chair leg makes when you drag it carelessly across a room. These had gone through the finish and into the wood itself, the kind of depth that required sustained pressure over the full length of the path. Whatever had made them had been heavy enough and moving slowly enough to dig in. I lay on my stomach on the hardwood with my cheek on the floor and shone the light into the full depth of the underbed space and looked at the starting point. The centered mark where the scratches originated was deepest, a compressed area slightly wider than the tracks that led from it, like the point where the most weight had been concentrated before something began to move. Something had been under the center of my bed, had rested there long enough or heavily enough to make that initial compression, and then had moved toward the door. I pushed myself up off the floor, sat on the edge of the mattress, put my phone down, thought about 7 months of sleeping in this room, in this bed, above that floor, thought about how many nights that was. 212. I want to tell you about the house first, because it matters. It was built in 1941, which you could feel in the way old houses communicate their age. Not in disrepair, nothing falling apart, but in the particular density of everything. The walls were plaster over lath, not drywall, and they held sound differently than modern construction. The floors were quarter-sawn white oak, original, the kind of wood that aged into something you couldn't replicate cheaply. The basement had a stone foundation and a pull-string bulb and smelled like every basement in every old house in every Midwestern city that's been standing through 80 years of weather. Earth and stone and the mineral cold of deep ground. The landlord's name was Gerald, 70, retired, lived 4 streets over in a house he'd owned for 30 years, a man who answered maintenance requests with the particular energy of someone who had been doing this long enough to know which problems actually required action and which ones sorted themselves out if you waited long enough. He was pleasant. He was not especially forthcoming. When I'd signed the lease, I'd asked the standard questions, previous tenants, any known issues, neighbors, and he'd answered them all in the brief, sufficient way of a man who considered the asking of questions a formality both parties understood to be theatrical. 2 previous tenants, he'd said, both short stays. One was a graduate student, transferred out of the program. One was a young couple, bought a house of their own after a year. Both gone for ordinary, explicable reasons. I had accepted that. I called Gerald on a Thursday, 4 days after I found the scratches. Told him I'd found damage to the bedroom floor. Significant scratches, running from under the bed to the door, through the finish, and into the wood. I wanted him to see them, wanted documentation that I hadn't caused them, and I also, though I didn't say this part out loud, wanted to watch his face when he looked at them. He came over the following Saturday morning, stood in my bedroom doorway while I crouched beside the bed and showed him the marks with my flashlight. He looked at them for a long time. Longer than the casual assessment of a landlord calculating repair costs. "Could be settling," he said finally. I looked up at him. Settling. Old house. Wood moves. Contracts in the cold. He straightened up, hands in the pockets of his jacket. "I'll note it in the file. Gerald." I kept my voice even. "These go from under my bed to the door in a straight line. Wood doesn't settle in a straight line from a specific point." He looked at me. Something moved behind his eyes. A calculation, or a decision, or maybe just the look of a man who had heard something he didn't want to engage with and was choosing not to engage with it. "I'll look into getting them refinished," he said. "Keep an eye on it." He left. I stood at the bedroom window and watched him walk to his car, and I thought about the 2 previous tenants. The graduate student who transferred out of the program, the young couple who bought a house of their own. Both short stays, Gerald had said, in the tone of someone offering context rather than pattern. I went to the kitchen and sat at the table with my laptop and spent an hour I didn't entirely have looking for any record I could find of those tenants. No forwarding information, no way to contact them, no trail that a non-investigator sitting at a kitchen table with a coffee could reasonably follow. Dead ends, quickly. What I had instead was my own 7 months of experience, filtered now through a different set of questions. Had anything else been wrong, or strange, or off? Had I noticed things I'd explained away, the way people do, the way the brain gently reroutes around anomalies and calls them quirks of the space? I thought about it honestly. The sleep. It had been bad since the first week, and I'd attributed it to the new space, the adjustment period every new home required. The particular adjustment of sleeping alone in a house rather than an apartment building where other people's proximity was a form of company. I'd started waking at 2 or 3 regularly, lying in the dark, listening to the house, a low unease I couldn't locate or name that I'd put down to the isolation of a detached house after years of apartment living. I'd told a friend about it in October. I just can't get used to the quiet. It's weird. It doesn't feel settled yet. And she'd said all new places took time. The smell. Once or twice in the bedroom, I'd caught something low and organic that didn't belong to the room. Not the clean wood smell of old floors. Something else, something with a dampness to it that I'd attributed to the heating system pulling air from the basement ducts when it kicked on. Old house, old ductwork, smells traveled, the feeling of the room. I don't know how else to say this. Some rooms in a house feel inhabited, and some don't. And my bedroom had always felt, on some level I'd never examined, inhabited. Not by me. By something that had been there before me and was still, somehow, residually present. I'd thought it was the character of the old house. The weight of 80 years of other people's lives in the walls. I had a low bed frame. I want to say that plainly, because the geometry of it had been sitting at the edge of my thinking all week, and I needed to say it out loud, even if only to myself. A platform frame, 8 inches off the floor, close to the ground, the underbed space shallow but sufficient, technically sufficient for something that wasn't especially large to fit in the dark beneath the mattress and lie there in the compressed center of the space and not be visible from either side without a light and the specific motivation of a dropped earring. I shut the laptop, went upstairs, stood in my bedroom doorway, and looked at the scratches in the angle of the afternoon light, which caught the bright stripped wood and made them more visible than they were in the morning. 6 feet. Start to end. The compression at the origin point, the parallel tracks, the end point at the base of the door. I had lived above this for 7 months, had put myself to sleep 8 inches above the origin point, in the dark, in the quiet, 212 times. I thought about the second bedroom across the hall, the storage room I never used, never went into, just stacked boxes and furniture I didn't need immediately. Closed the door. Hadn't been in it in 3 weeks at least. I crossed the hallway and opened the door. The room was mostly boxes, the furniture I'd stacked along the far wall. A folding table, a spare chair, a floor lamp I'd decided didn't work in the living room, the window on the north wall, the closet in the corner, bifold doors. Both doors were open. I kept those doors closed. Not for any considered reason, just the instinct toward tidiness when the room was being used for storage. Closed the closet, contained the disorder. I hadn't been in this room in 3 weeks, and the closet doors were open. The interior of the closet was empty. I stored nothing in it, had never put anything in it. It had been empty since the day I moved in. Just a bare closet, wire shelving, the back wall. On the back wall, at roughly knee height, scratches. The same pattern, the same depth, the same character, the same parallel marks of something heavy moving in a sustained line. They ran from the closet's back wall toward the open doors and stopped at the threshold. Toward the open doors, which were open when they should have been closed. I stood in the storage room doorway with the afternoon light falling through the north window, and I looked at the scratches in the closet, and I did not go in to measure them with my fingernail. I did not get down on the floor. I just stood in the doorway and looked, and then I went downstairs and sat on the couch and called my sister in Columbus and talked to her for an hour and a half about anything except what I'd just found. Because some part of me understood by then that knowing more was not going to make this better. It was only going to make it real. I called Gerald again on Sunday. Not about the closet. I hadn't decided yet what to do about the closet. Hadn't fully processed what finding the same marks in a second room meant about the scope of what I was dealing with. I called him about the previous tenants. Told him I'd like to reach out to them if possible, that I had some questions about the house, routine things, that I'd appreciate contact information if he had it. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't give out tenant information," he said. "Privacy." "I understand. Could you pass my information along to them and ask if they'd be willing to talk?" Another pause, shorter. "I'll see what I can do." He didn't call back. What he did instead was show up at the house on Monday evening without calling ahead, which he had never done in 7 months. Had always texted, always given notice, always arrived at the agreed time with the agreeable punctuality of a man who considered the scheduling of access a courtesy he owed. He knocked at 6:30 while I was making dinner and stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and asked if he could come in. I let him in. Stood in my own kitchen and watched him settle into the chair at the table, the chair across from mine, the one I always pushed in and always found pulled out, which I noticed because it was the thing I always noticed now, and fold his hands on the table. "About the previous tenants," he said. "Okay." "The graduate student, her name was Petra. She left because—" He stopped, restarted. "She asked to be released from the lease in month 4. Said the house didn't suit her. I didn't press it." "And the couple?" "The Warfields. 8 months." He looked at his folded hands. "She called me about scratches on the floor. I told her the same thing I told you. Old house, wood moves. She didn't believe me either." He paused. "They were gone 3 weeks later." The kitchen was quiet. The pot on the stove behind me had started a low bubble, and I reached back and turned the burner down without looking away from him. "How long ago was that?" I asked. 18 months. I sat down across from him. The pulled-out chair, which I pushed in automatically and then immediately noticed I'd done. "Gerald, what is in this house?" He looked at me for a long moment. The look of a man who has been carrying something for long enough that the weight of it had become indistinguishable from his own weight, part of how he moved through the world. "I don't know," he said. "I have never known exactly." He unfolded his hands, folded them again. "The house was my parents'. I grew up in it. The scratches started when I was 12, in my bedroom, which is the room you're using now. A pause. My parents told me it was the dog. We didn't have a dog. The burner behind me ticked in the silence. It goes away, he said. For years at a time, it goes away. I lived there until I was 22, and after the first few years, it just stopped. Whatever it was, it stopped. I sold it and bought it back twice over the years, rented it out. Sometimes tenants said nothing. Sometimes they said something. The Warfields said something. Petra said something. He looked at me steadily. You're saying something. I'm saying something, I agreed. He was quiet. The scratches go from under the bed to the door, I said. And I found the same marks in the storage room closet, in a room I haven't been in for 3 weeks. I watched his face. Whatever it is, it was in the storage room closet. Before that, it was under my bed. It's moving through the house. Gerald looked at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not guilt exactly, not fear exactly. Something older and more settled than either of those. The expression of a person who has been living alongside something they can't explain for so long that the inexplicability had become just another feature of their life. It doesn't hurt anyone, he said. In 40 years, it has never hurt anyone. That you know of. He accepted that with a small nod that told me he'd thought about it too. What do I do? I asked. Most people leave, he said. I sat with that. Thought about 7 months. The plants on the windowsill, the good lamp, the particular satisfaction of a whole house after years of apartments, the thing I'd told everyone I knew about, the rug I'd paid too much for, the floors I'd learned by sound and feel, and the path of a dropped earring on a Tuesday morning. What do the ones who don't leave do? I asked. He thought about it for a moment, like it was a question he hadn't been asked before, or hadn't expected to be asked. They learn to sleep with the light on, he said. Most of them. He left shortly after, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car pull away and thought about 12-year-old Gerald in the room I slept in, lying above the scratches in the dark, his parents telling him it was a dog they didn't own. 40 years of carrying that. Selling the house and buying it back, renting it out, watching tenants come and go, standing in the bedroom doorway, looking at the marks in the floor with the careful eyes of someone who had looked at them many times before. The pot on the stove had gone to a full boil without my noticing. I turned it off and stood in the kitchen in the sudden quiet and thought about the storage room across the upstairs hall. The open closet. The scratches that stopped at the threshold of the open doors. That direction, that specific direction. Out of the closet and into the room, and from there into the hall. I hadn't checked the hall. I went upstairs. The hall was narrow, the original runner worn soft at the center, the bathroom door to the left and my bedroom door to the right. The afternoon light was gone now, just the overhead bulb I'd switched on at the base of the stairs. I stood at the top and looked at the floor. The runner hid most of it, but at the edges, in the exposed hardwood between the runner and the baseboard, faint, shallower than the bedroom marks, but there, a continuation of the same path. From the storage room doorway, across the hall, stopping at the threshold of my bedroom, where the marks I'd already found began. I stood in the hallway and understood, fully and completely for the first time, what the map looked like. Storage room closet to storage room door, across the hall, into my bedroom, under my bed. Not away from my room, not leaving, arriving. The scratches I'd found weren't an exit path, they were the return. I did not sleep in that house that night. I stood in the hallway for long enough that the overhead bulb's heat became something I could feel on the top of my head, and then I went downstairs, picked up my keys and my phone and the jacket hanging by the door, and drove to my friend Cassie's apartment across town. Told her my heat had gone out. Let her put me on her couch with a spare blanket, and woke up in the morning to the sound of her making coffee and the specific, enormous relief of being in a space that was not my house. I drove back in daylight. 9 in the morning, clear November sky, the house looking the way it always looked from the outside. Narrow, two-story, the window boxes I'd planted in October still holding the dead remains of the mums I'd put in them. The front door, the particular dark red of a house that had been repainted several times without anyone committing fully to a new color. Ordinary. It looked completely ordinary. I went inside and stood at the base of the stairs. The house was quiet, morning quiet, the particular quality of empty rooms in full daylight, clear, flat, no weight in it. The kind of quiet that doesn't hum. I stood at the bottom and looked up at the landing and thought about what Gerald had said. 40 years. It doesn't hurt anyone. Most people leave. I went up. The hall was as I'd left it. Runner-centered, bathroom door standing open, my bedroom door open, storage room door closed. I checked the baseboard edges of the runner first, crouching, getting close. The faint marks were still there in the exposed hardwood, faint but real, real but faint, the kind of thing you could spend years in this house not seeing unless you had a reason to look for them. I went into the storage room. The closet doors were closed. I stood in the doorway, with the morning light coming through the north window, and looked at them. Closed. Both panels, flush against each other, the way I kept them, the way they had not been 2 days ago when I'd found them open and the scratches running toward the threshold. I crossed to the closet and opened both doors. The back wall, the scratches I'd found, running from the wall toward me, toward the open doors, still there, same depth, same character. And at the starting point on the back wall, the same compressed origin mark I'd found under my bed. That initial concentration where the most weight had rested before movement began. But something was different. I got down on my knees and looked at the back wall more carefully. The origin mark, and I need you to understand that I am describing this exactly as I found it, with no interpretation added, was lower than I'd registered when I first looked, not knee height. Closer to the floor, 6, maybe 8 inches off the ground. The kind of height that made sense if whatever made it had been very low to the floor. Flattened, pressed against the baseboard with its full weight. Waiting. I sat back on my heels and thought about the geometry again. Low to the floor in the closet, flat and compressed. Moving out toward the storage room door, I went back to the hall marks and looked at them differently now, crouching, measuring with my eye, moving low, the faint marks close to the baseboard, below knee height, all the way across. Into my bedroom, under the bed. The compression point under the bed was 8 inches off the floor because the bed frame was 8 inches off the floor. Not because whatever made the marks had been resting elevated. Because the ceiling it had, my mattress, my box spring, the underside of my bed, was 8 inches from the ground. I stood up very slowly. I was not, I want to be clear, a person who believed in things that couldn't be explained. I was the person who kept the log, who measured with her fingernail, who asked the landlord for documentation and looked up previous tenants and stood in hallways with a flashlight cataloging evidence. Whatever this was, I had approached it the way I approached everything, empirically, methodically, with a preference for the explanation that required the fewest assumptions. But I was standing in the storage room of a 1941 house in western Pennsylvania on a November morning, and the fewest assumption explanation for what I had found was that something low to the ground and substantial in weight had been moving between this closet and the space beneath my bed on a schedule I hadn't detected in 212 nights, and had been doing it with enough regularity to mark the wood. Not passing through, not lost or random, returning, routinely, to the space directly below where I slept. I took photographs, all of it, the closet, the origin mark, the hall baseboard, the bedroom marks, the compression point under the bed. Documented thoroughly, the way the person I was required me to document things, even when the person I was had her hands unsteady on the phone and her breath coming slightly shorter than normal. Then I went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and pulled out my laptop and started looking at rental listings. Not because Gerald's 40 years meant nothing. Not because I'd stopped being the person who needed empirical confirmation before drawing conclusions. but because I had spent 7 months in this house, sleeping 8 inches above a space that something used routinely and deliberately as a place to return to. And that information, now that I had it, was not information I could unknow. The plants on the windowsill, the good lamp, the rug I'd paid too much for and never regretted. I looked at all of it from the kitchen table, and I thought about what it meant to have built something you liked in a space that was, and had always been, also someone else's. I found a listing by noon. I texted my sister that afternoon. Not about the scratches, not about Gerald, not about the geometry of low marks along baseboards or the compression point in a closet at 6 inches off the floor. Just thinking about moving. I'll explain later. She called immediately. I let it ring. I was looking at the kitchen chair across the table, the one that was always pulled out, the one I'd photographed 6 times and pushed back in and watched move again with the regularity of something habitual. Habitual. I pushed it in one final time, precisely and deliberately, and went upstairs to start packing. I was out in 11 days. My sister helped me move that weekend. She'd driven up from Columbus without asking twice, the way she does, the way she has always done. Showing up with coffee and a rented van and the particular brisk competence of someone who understood that questions could wait until boxes were loaded. I told her everything on the drive back. The scratches, Gerald, the Warfields, the origin mark at 6 inches off the floor, the chair. She was quiet for the length of an exit ramp. The chair was the worst part, she said finally. I knew what she meant. The scratches were frightening in the abstract way of evidence. Marks on a floor, a geometry of movement, a thing that could be measured and documented and held at the distance of a problem to be solved. But the chair was intimate. The chair was something sitting across the table from me every morning, choosing that seat, returning to it. Something that had spent 7 months sharing a kitchen with me in the specific ordinary way of a household member, pulling out its chair and pushing it back and pulling it out again. 7 months of breakfast across from something I couldn't see. I think about that more than I think about the floor. Gerald called me a month after I left. Not about the deposit. He returned it in full, no discussion, which told me something about how the math looked to him. He called just to check in, he said, which I found I believed. He asked how I was settling into the new place. I told him fine, which was mostly true. I asked him if the scratches had started again. He was quiet for a moment. Not yet, he said. Not yet. Not no. Not the house is empty and quiet and there's nothing there. Just not yet. With the patient resignation of a man who had been in this conversation with himself for 40 years and knew exactly what the calendar looked like. I didn't ask anything else. We said goodbye in the careful way of two people who have shared something strange and don't have a framework for what that makes them to each other. I live in an apartment now, 2nd floor, which I chose deliberately. 1 floor up, 1 floor below, people in every direction. Hardwood floors throughout, the original kind, old and dense and communicative in the way of floors that have been walked on for decades. I check under my bed every night, not with a flashlight, not down on my hands and knees, just a look. A quick sweep of the phone light into the underbed space, 3 seconds, a confirmation that what's there is what I put there and nothing else. I've done it every night for 2 years without finding anything. I check the floor too. Not every morning, not anymore, but often enough that I know the grain of the boards in this bedroom the way I knew them in the house. The direction they run, the width between them, the small imperfections in the finish that I cataloged in the first week and have memorized since. If something changed, I would know. I would see it immediately, in the way you see the thing that doesn't belong in a space you have learned completely. That's the version of safety I have now, not certainty, not the clean resolution of something explained and closed, just the knowledge that I have learned this floor, that I would notice, that the earring doesn't need to fall a second time. The rug from the house, the one I'd paid too much for in the rust and cream. I kept it. It's in the living room here, centered under the coffee table, wearing its new apartment well. Some things you keep. The kitchen chair in the new place I keep pushed in. All of them, every one, flush against the table. I notice immediately when any of them is out. So far they haven't been. I found a chair positioned directly in front of my bed, facing where I sleep. I don't own that chair. The chair was not there when I went to bed. I know this with the specific, unambiguous certainty of someone who has thought about very little else for the 18 months since it happened and has turned the timeline over so many times that every detail in it has been worn smooth and clear. I went to bed at 11:40. I lay on top of the covers for maybe 20 minutes, reading on my phone before I turned the light off. The foot of the bed was visible from where I lay. It is a small room, the bedroom, 9 feet by 11, with the bed against the east wall and the door to the hallway directly opposite. And in 20 minutes of lying there with the room dark except for the phone screen, I would have seen a chair. It is not possible that a chair was there, and I failed to notice it. There was no chair. I woke at 6:14 to my alarm. The chair was there, a wooden kitchen chair, not mine, not any chair I had ever owned or purchased or received or borrowed. Positioned at the foot of my bed, angled slightly inward, facing the pillow where my head had been for the past 6 hours. Ladderback, painted white at some point, and worn down to bare wood at the arms and the top rail, the kind of chair that accumulates in houses over decades and ends up in second-hand stores and alley-side collection piles. Ordinary, anonymous. Positioned with an exactness that I noticed before I understood why it disturbed me so specifically. Not pushed against the wall, not casually placed, but angled and centered, the front legs equidistant from the corners of the mattress. Someone had taken care with where they put it. I should tell you about the apartment before I tell you anything else, because the apartment is the context without which the rest of this is just a chair in a room and a man who was confused about his furniture. It was a ground-floor unit in a 4-story building, a detail that I had noted and then consciously decided not to let bother me because ground-floor rent's at a discount, and I had recently changed cities for work and was, at the time, in the middle of a financial adjustment period that made discount a meaningful word. The windows faced a narrow service alley on one side and the building's shared courtyard on the other. The lease was standard. The building was managed by a company rather than an individual. The neighbors I had met were normal to the point of unremarkability. It was a fine apartment. It was on the ground floor. My name is Marcus, and I am, by nature and by profession, I work in logistics, the operational side, the part that is entirely about sequence and process and closing gaps between states. A person who does not leave variables unaccounted for. I triple lock my car. I read insurance documents. I am the person in my social circle who gets asked to proofread things and finds errors. I am not, in any meaningful sense, someone who could have owned a wooden ladder-back chair and forgotten about it. I sat up in bed and looked at the chair for a long time. I did the obvious things first, as methodically as the situation allowed. Checked the bedroom window, a sliding sash type, original to the building, latched from inside. Checked the second window in the living room, same type, same result. The front door was dead-bolted, the chain engaged, exactly as I had left it. My keys were on the hook inside the door where they always lived. Nothing in the apartment was missing, disturbed, or moved. Only the chair was different. Only the chair was new. I walked around it once, the way you walk around a thing you are trying to understand from all available angles. Up close, it was ordinary in every particular. Worn wood, a faint smell of old paint, and something else I couldn't name. A slight wobble in the back right leg when I pressed against it that suggested age and use, and a history of standing on uneven floors in various places before it arrived, without explanation, in mine. I picked up my phone. I stood in my bedroom at 6:18 in the morning with a wooden chair at the foot of my bed, and I tried to decide who to call and what to say and how to say it without sounding like someone who had done something embarrassing with their own furniture and was now misremembering it. I put the phone down. Then I picked it back up, opened my camera, and photographed the chair from 4 different angles. The positions of the legs relative to the bed. The gap between the front rail and the mattress, 11 inches. I measured it later. The exact distance you would leave if you wanted to be able to stand comfortably, to lean forward, to be close, but not touching. The exact distance you would leave if you were planning to sit there for a while. I called my building manager at 8 a.m. when the office opened. Her name was Renata, and she had the particular telephone manner of someone who manages a large number of units and has developed a professional tolerance for the full spectrum of tenant concerns, from genuinely urgent to aggressively mundane. I told her I'd found a chair in my bedroom that didn't belong to me, and that I needed to know if anyone had accessed my unit overnight. A pause while she processed this. "A chair," she said, in the tone of someone making sure they'd heard correctly. "A wooden kitchen chair, ladderback, white paint. It was not in my apartment when I went to sleep." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll check the access log," she said. "We have a digital entry system on the building entrance and the maintenance closets. All key fob access is logged." She called me back 22 minutes later. No fob access to the building between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. The maintenance team had no scheduled work in my unit. No emergency access had been authorized. The log was clean. "The windows," I said. "The ground floor units. Has there been any history of window access? Any previous tenant reports?" A beat that ran slightly too long. "Not that I'm aware of," she said, "but I can check." She didn't call back about the windows. I noted this. I spent the day at work in a state that I can only describe as bifurcated. One half of me in meetings, responding to emails, managing the daily operational problems that logistics management produces in reliable volume, and the other half running a parallel process on the chair. Building access clean, windows latched from inside, no visible damage, no missing items, no disturbed surfaces, no evidence of forced entry anywhere I could identify. The chair existed. I had existed in the same apartment as the chair for 6 hours without knowing it was there. These two facts were irreconcilable, and the gap between them was exactly the kind of gap I am professionally trained to close, and I could not close it. I went home at 6. The chair was still there. I had left it precisely as I found it because moving it felt like disturbing evidence, and I went and stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at it again in the flat evening light and tried to find the explanation I had missed that morning. Then I went around the apartment with a different quality of attention than I'd applied that morning. Not checking locks, I'd checked locks. Looking instead for the things locks don't account for. The spaces that get accepted as fixed features of a room without ever being examined as points of vulnerability. The bedroom window was a sliding sash, latched by a small pivoting lever that engaged a strike plate in the upper frame. Standard residential hardware, probably original to the building's 1970s construction, designed at a time when security standards were substantially different. I examined it the way I would examine a gap in a supply chain, not as a window, but as a system, looking for the failure point. Found it in approximately 90 seconds. The strike plate was set shallow, the screws securing it to the frame backing into a wood that had dried and contracted over 50 years until 2 of the 4 were engaging with almost nothing. The lever engaged the plate, but the plate moved under pressure. Not freely, it resisted, but with enough sustained lateral force applied to the window from outside, directed at the right angle, the latch would disengage before the window broke. Someone with patience and knowledge of old residential hardware could have opened this window from the outside, could have come in, placed the chair, gone back out, engaged the latch from inside through the gap in the casement. Old sash windows left a gap at the meeting rail that a thin tool could navigate, and left the window appearing locked to anyone who didn't examine the strike plate closely. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the chair and thought about this scenario with the systematic clarity of a person who is very good at identifying process failures and very bad at knowing what to do with the emotional content they generate. Then I thought about the position of the chair again, the care of its placement, the 11 inches, the inward angle. A burglar does not position furniture. A person testing a window's vulnerabilities does not bring a chair. These are 2 separate categories of intent, and the chair put this firmly in the second category, and the second category was one I did not have a professional framework for and could not close the gap on by examining strike plates. I called my friend Dev, who is a large, practical, deeply unflappable man who had served 8 years in the army before becoming an electrician, and who I knew from experience would not perform concern but would assess a situation and tell me what he actually thought. "I need you to come look at something," I said. "Tonight?" "Tonight? Yes." He came at 8. I showed him the chair and the window and told him the access log was clean, and he went around the apartment himself, methodically, without saying much. When he came back, he stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at the chair for a moment, and then looked at me. "You slept in here last night with that in the room," he said. "I didn't know it was there." "Right." He was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, someone was in this apartment while you were sleeping." I had known this since 6:14 that morning, and had spent the day building alternative explanations and discarding them one by one and arriving at the same destination every time. Hearing Dev say it plainly, in the flat declarative register he reserved for facts he considered established, removed the last of the explanation's structural integrity. "I know," I said. "Okay," he said. "Then we deal with it." Dealing with it, Dev style, meant 3 things in the following order: replace the window hardware that night, file a police report in the morning, and install a secondary door bolt before I slept in the apartment again. He had the window hardware replaced in 40 minutes. He'd stopped at a hardware store on the way over, apparently, which told me something about how seriously he'd taken my call. New strike plate, longer screws into fresh wood, a secondary window lock that clamped the sash regardless of the latch position. He worked with the economy of someone who does this for a living and finds most residential security hardware an embarrassment, which is what he called it, specifically, twice. An embarrassment. I held the flashlight and didn't say much and thought about the old strike plate and its 50-year-old shallow screws and the 50 years of tenants who had looked at that window and considered it locked. We called the non-emergency police line at 9 p.m. rather than waiting for morning, because Dev pointed out, correctly, that I was about to sleep in an apartment where a stranger had been standing over me 6 hours earlier, and that reporting it promptly was the reasonable thing to do, regardless of how minor the duty officer might treat it. An officer came at 10:30, took the report, looked at the chair and the window and my photographs, and wrote things down with the careful thoroughness of someone who is managing their own skepticism on my behalf. He asked if anything was stolen. I said no. He asked if I had any idea who might have done this. I said no. He asked if I had any ongoing disputes with neighbors, former partners, anyone who might want to frighten me. I said no to all of it. He took the report, left a card, said someone would follow up. Nobody followed up in the first week. Dev stayed that first night, sleeping on the couch without being asked, and in the morning he installed the secondary bolt on the front door before he left. A surface mount barrel bolt, heavy gauge, the kind that requires the door to be physically broken through rather than picked or leveraged. He stood back and looked at it with professional satisfaction and said, "Now you close this when you're inside, and nobody comes through that door without you knowing about it." He looked at me. "You close it every night?" "Every night," I said. He nodded, left. I stood in the apartment alone for the first time since the morning of the chair and looked at the bolt and the new window hardware and tried to feel the security they were supposed to provide. I moved the chair to the hallway outside my apartment door. I could not make myself put it inside any of my rooms, and I could not make myself throw it in the building dumpster without having photographed it from every angle and logged its dimensions and noted the paint wear and the wobble in the back right leg in a document I saved to my phone and backed up twice. It sat in the hall for 2 days, which is how long it took before my downstairs neighbor stopped and looked at it and knocked on my door and asked if I was getting rid of it. I said yes, and watched her carry it downstairs, and felt something unclench in me that had been clenched since Monday morning. That should have been the end of it. The window was fixed, the bolt was installed, the report was filed, the chair was gone. A gap had been identified, closed, and documented. In a professional context, this would have constituted a resolved incident. I tried to treat it that way. Then, 11 days after the first chair, I came home from work to find the bedroom window screen sitting on the floor inside the room, leaned neatly against the wall below the window. Dev's new hardware was intact. The sash was closed, the clamp lock engaged, everything as I had left it. The window had not been opened. I checked the clamp, checked the latch, pressed against the sash from inside until my palms went white with the force of it, and it did not move. The screen had been removed from the outside. A window screen can be removed from the exterior by someone who knows what they are doing. The spline presses back, the frame pops free. The whole thing lifts out in under 30 seconds. It requires access to the exterior of the window and nothing else. What it requires on the inside is nothing at all. It is a demonstrative act, not an entry act. It is not how you get in. It is how you show someone that you are outside their window and that you can reach it and that the hardware changes they made have been noted. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the screen leaned against the wall and understood that this was a communication. Not a burglary, not a random intrusion, not an opportunist who had found a loose strike plate and taken a one-time look inside. A communication directed specifically at me in my specific bedroom from someone who had come back 11 days after I'd made it harder and wanted me to know they had. The logistics professional in me identified it immediately for what it was. An acknowledgement. You changed the terms. I am acknowledging the change. I am still here. My hands were not shaking. I want to note that because it surprised me at the time. I was frightened in a way that went very deep and very still, the way fear goes when it has passed through the acute phase and arrived at something more considered and more lasting. Not the sharp adrenaline of the first morning, something colder and more patient than that. I picked up my phone and I called Dev, and then I called the police again, and this time I did not call the non-emergency line. 2 officers arrived within 12 minutes, different from the first officer. Younger, both of them, and they took the screen seriously in a way the first report had not quite managed to generate. One of them, a woman named Officer Castillo, understood the communication logic immediately without me having to walk her through it. "So whoever this is came back after you secured the window," she said, looking at the screen propped against the wall, "to show you they'd been outside it." "That's my read," I said. "That's our read too." She looked at me steadily. "This isn't random. You understand that?" "I do." What followed over the next 3 days was the most concentrated exercise in gap analysis I have ever conducted, and I have been conducting gap analysis professionally for 11 years. Castillo connected my 2 reports and opened a single case file. A detective was assigned, a man named Okafor, mid-40s, with the particular unhurried intelligence of someone who has been doing this long enough to pattern match quickly and doesn't perform the process for the benefit of the room. He came to the apartment on the second day and walked every room and asked questions that were specific and non-linear in the way of someone who already had a framework and was filling it in. He asked when I had moved in. 8 months ago, he asked about the previous tenant. I didn't know anything beyond what building management had told me. A woman lived there 2 years, forwarding address out of state. He asked if I had noticed anyone in the building or surrounding area who seemed to take unusual interest in me or my unit. I had not, but I went back through the past 8 months in my memory the way you review a data set for the anomaly you didn't flag in real time. A man I'd seen twice in the service alley, once when I was taking recycling out, once when I was coming back from a run, who had been looking at the building's exterior in a way I had registered and then set aside. Not aggressive, not obviously out of place, just present. Standing in an alley behind a residential building looking at it with the focused attention of someone assessing something rather than passing through. I told Okafor. He wrote it down without visible reaction. Description? I gave what I had. Average height, average build, dark jacket. One detail I remembered clearly because it had snagged on something in my operational mind at the time. He'd been holding a small notebook, not a phone, a paper notebook, pocket-sized, and when I'd come out of the building door he had looked at me and then looked back at the building in a way that felt like the second look was the more important one. Okafor looked at me for a moment when I finished. How long ago was the first time you saw him? I thought about it, went back to the recycling run, reconstructed the day around it. 6 months ago, maybe 6.5. 2 months before the chair. Okafor made a note. Didn't say what the note meant. I had learned by that point not to ask questions that would be answered with careful, incomplete honesty, and to instead pay attention to which things he wrote down and what his face did when he wrote them. His face did something when he wrote that one. Building management was formally contacted and asked to produce the access log for a longer window than Renata had checked. Not one night, but the past 8 months. Every fob entry and exit for the building, flagged against the hours I was most reliably absent. They produced it in 2 days. Okafor reviewed it with me and identified 6 entries through the service entrance, a secondary door accessible from the alley, requiring a fob, during evening hours on days that matched my standing Thursday late shift pattern. 6 Thursdays, across 4 months, when I reliably left the building at 6 and returned at 10. 6 fob entries through the service door between 7 and 9 p.m. The fob registered to a former resident, a man who had lived in the building 3 years prior, in a different unit, on the 3rd floor. Had moved out, apparently returned his primary fob, but the secondary fob, issued for the service entrance, a separate system, had not been deactivated. A building management oversight. The gap in the system had existed for 3 years. 3 years of a service entrance fob belonging to a man who no longer lived there, still active, never flagged. I looked at the log entry dates and ran the arithmetic on how long I had been in the apartment versus when the entries started, and the entries started 2 months in. 2 months of establishing my schedule, my patterns, my reliable absences. 2 months of a man with a notebook standing in the service alley, looking at a building before whatever he concluded from that assessment produced a Thursday evening entry through a door that hadn't been locked against him in 3 years. Okafor closed his notebook and looked at me across my kitchen table. "We have a name," he said. "We're working on location." I asked if I was safe in the apartment. He looked at me for a moment in that measuring, honest way. "The service fob has been deactivated as of this morning. The window hardware Dev installed is sound. The barrel bolt on the front door is the right call." A pause. "I would feel better if you had someone staying with you for the next few nights." He would feel better. Not a directive. An honest assessment from a man who had just told me they had a name and were working on location, which meant the name was not yet in custody, which meant the man with the notebook was somewhere, and the somewhere was not a cell. Dev was already on his way before I'd finished the call. He was found 9 days later. Okafor called on a Thursday, the same day of the week that had been used against me for 4 months, which I noticed and did not find amusing, and said the individual had been located and taken into custody and that the case was moving forward. He gave me a case number for the DA's office and a victim's advocate contact and answered 3 of my 4 questions directly before the 4th. What was he planning? Produced a pause and then, "That's something we're still building a picture of. I can tell you the evidence recovered from his residence was extensive." Extensive. I asked what that meant. Okafor said he couldn't go into detail at that stage. I thanked him and hung up and sat with the word for a long time. Extensive evidence from the residence of a man who had spent 4 months building a detailed operational picture of my schedule, my apartment's vulnerabilities, my reliable absences, who had come in through a dead tenant's service fob on 6 separate Thursdays, and on at least one of those Thursdays had stood in my bedroom at night while I was sleeping and positioned a chair with an 11-inch gap at the foot of my bed and left before morning. What the chair was for, I was never officially told. The word extensive was the closest thing to an answer I received, and I have done what I suspect Okafor knew I would do, which is that I have built the picture myself from the available evidence, and I do not find the picture I have built reassuring. I keep it in the category of things I have accounted for and cannot close, which is a category that did not exist in me before this happened, and which I manage the way I manage other persistent operational problems, by acknowledging it, building around it, and not pretending it isn't there. I left the apartment 4 months after the arrest, not because I felt unsafe. The fob was deactivated, Dev's hardware held, the barrel bolt was as solid as advertised, but because the ground floor had become a variable I was no longer willing to carry. I live on the 5th floor now, in a building with a managed entry system that logs every access and whose property manager I called 3 times before signing the lease to confirm the deactivation protocol for former tenant credentials. She answered all 3 calls. I signed. I have not owned a wooden kitchen chair since. This is a choice that I acknowledge is not entirely rational and that I am not in any particular hurry to revisit. Dev finds it mildly ridiculous and tells me so periodically in the affectionate, unsparing way that is his primary mode of friendship. I tell him he is probably right and go on not owning one. The notebook was in the evidence recovered from the residence. Okafor mentioned it once briefly when I asked if the man I had seen twice in the alley was confirmed as the same individual. He confirmed it. I asked about the notebook, and there was a pause, and he said it contained observations. And I said, observations of what? And he said he really couldn't go into more detail at that stage. He has never gone into more detail. I have spent 18 months with that gap open in the sequence. I am a person who closes gaps. I close them professionally, systematically, with the specific satisfaction of a process completed and a variable resolved. This one I cannot close. The notebook existed, contained observations, was extensive enough to qualify as evidence, and its contents were determined by a man who stood in the service alley outside my window with a careful kind of attention and wrote things down. What he wrote, why he wrote it, what came next in the sequence he was building. Some gaps, I have learned, do not close. You account for them. You build around them. You move to the 5th floor and you bolt the door, and you live your life in the space that remains. But you never stop knowing the gap is there. I noticed the rug in my hallway had been flipped over. Underneath was a hatch I never knew was there. The rug had a pattern on one side and a rubber backing on the other, and I had looked at the pattern side every single day for 2 years. I know it was 2 years because I bought the rug the week I moved in, a Killam runner, burnt orange and navy, from a home goods store 2 blocks from my apartment. I remember carrying it home under my arm because it had been raining and I hadn't brought a bag large enough, and I'd been annoyed about it for the 6-minute walk. I remember unrolling it in the hallway and stepping back to look at it and thinking that it made the apartment feel like mine in a way that the lease signing hadn't. Small domestic anchors, the things that make a space yours. For 2 years I had walked over that rug every morning on the way to the kitchen, and every night on the way to bed, and every time I'd come through the front door. Its pattern was as familiar to me as the grain of my kitchen table, or the specific squeak of the 3rd stair in my building's common stairwell. I knew that rug, which is why, when I came home on a Tuesday evening in March and found it face down in the hallway, I stopped walking immediately, not moved, flipped. The rubber backing facing up, gray and utilitarian and webbed with the faint grid pattern that grips the floor, and the burnt orange and navy face pressed against the floorboards underneath. The runner was still positioned correctly along the length of the hallway, still centered between the walls, still aligned with the front door the way I always kept it. It had been turned over in place with a precision that ruled out any explanation involving the rug shifting or curling or being disturbed by a draft. Someone had picked it up, flipped it over, and put it back down. I stood in my open doorway for a moment before I stepped inside, long enough to check the hallway in both directions, empty as it always was at 7 in the evening in this particular building of quiet, professional tenants who kept to themselves. Long enough to listen. Long enough for my brain to produce and discard 3 explanations in rapid succession, none of which survived contact with the precision of that positioning. I went inside. I locked the door behind me. I stood in the hallway looking at the upturned rug and thought about whether to flip it back, which is an odd thing to hesitate over, and yet I hesitated. Eventually, I crouched down and took the near edge of the runner and turned it back over, and the pattern came back up, and the rubber backing went down, and everything looked exactly as it should have, except that it didn't, because the rug had been face down in my hallway, and I had not put it that way. I went through the apartment the way I always did when something was wrong. Methodical, each room, each closet, behind the shower curtain. Everything in order, nothing missing, nothing disturbed, nothing to suggest that anyone had been inside, except the rug that I had already flipped back over, and could now almost convince myself I'd imagine. I called my building super, a taciturn Ukrainian man named Dmitro, who communicated in the compressed, functional sentences of someone who had learned English primarily for professional purposes. I asked if anyone had been in my apartment that day. Maintenance, inspections, anything. He said no. I asked if he was certain. He said yes, and then asked if there was a problem with something. I said the rug had been moved. There was a brief silence that I interpreted as the specific silence of a man deciding whether this qualified as a maintenance issue. And then he said he would check if anyone had needed access and call me back. He called me back in 20 minutes and said no one had been in my unit. Building records showed no access, no maintenance requests, no inspections scheduled or carried out. I thanked him and hung up, and stood in the kitchen and ate the dinner I'd brought home, with the specific mechanical quality of someone going through motions while their mind is occupied somewhere else entirely. After dinner, I went back to the hallway, stood over the rug, looked at it. And then I looked at the floor around it with the attention I hadn't given it on the first pass. Really looked, crouching down with my phone torch on, examining the floorboards. On either side of the rug's long edges, where the rubber backing met the hardwood, the floor was clean, dust-free, the way floors are when something sits on them long enough to protect the surface beneath. But at the ends, at the short edges where the tips of the runner terminated, the floor should have been clean too, protected by the rug's weight for 2 years. It wasn't. There were scratches in the hardwood at the near end of the rug, fresh ones, pale against the darker finish, shallow but definite, the kind of marks left by something being dragged or levered. Recent enough that the wood inside the scratches hadn't yet had time to oxidize to the surrounding color. Something had been opened here. Under the rug, at the end closest to my bedroom, I pulled the rug back fully for the first time in 2 years. The hatch was approximately 2 feet by 2 feet, a square cut into the floorboards with a precision that had clearly not been recent, the edges worn smooth and dark with age, a small recessed pull ring set flush with the surface. It was built into the floor as though it had always been there, as though it belonged to the apartment's original construction, and it had been sitting under my rug for 2 years while I walked over it every single night on my way to bed. I knelt there in my hallway with the rug folded back and looked at the pull ring and the seam of the hatch, and tried to remember every conversation I'd ever had with my landlord about the apartment's history, and came up with nothing that touched this. 2 years. I had lived here for 2 years, and I had never known. The question that arrived next, and that has not left me since, was not what was under the hatch. It was who else had known it was there. I did not open the hatch that night. I want to be clear that this was not bravery or restraint. It was the simple arithmetic of being alone in an apartment at 8 p.m. with no one who knew where I was, and a hole in my floor that someone had recently opened, and I had no information about what was underneath it. The arithmetic came out against opening it. I folded the rug back over it, precisely as I'd found it the first time, rubber backing up, pattern pressed to the floor, and I went to my bedroom and closed the door, and did not sleep particularly well. In the morning I called my landlord. His name was Ferdinand Cho, mid-70s, semi-retired, the kind of landlord who had owned the building long enough that he related to it the way people relate to elderly relatives, with a mixture of genuine affection and selective blindness about its problems. I had a cordial relationship with him built on 12 on-time rent payments a year and the occasional brief conversation about the building's boiler. I told him I'd found a hatch in my hallway floor and asked what he knew about it. The pause that followed was longer than I expected. "Under the rug?" he said. The fact that he knew about the rug, that his first instinct was to locate the hatch relative to the rug rather than ask me where in the hallway, told me everything about whether this was news to him. "Yes," I said. "Under the rug." He was quiet for another moment. "That's original to the building," he said finally. The building was constructed in 1931. Buildings of that era sometimes had storage access points built into the floors, before basement storage was standardized. It connects to a crawl space. A pause. "It should have been disclosed. I apologize for that." He said it with the smooth, slightly rehearsed quality of a man delivering a prepared explanation. Not lying, exactly. I believed the historical detail, which I later verified, but not telling me everything either. The specific smoothness of a partial truth. "Has anyone else had access to that crawl space?" I asked. "Not to my knowledge. It's not used. The hatch was opened recently. There are fresh scratches in the floor around it." A silence. "I'll come by this week and have a look," he said. He came on Thursday. Dimitro was with him, which suggested Ferdinand had wanted a witness or a second opinion, or simply didn't want to be alone in the apartment with whatever the hatch contained. They were thorough and professional, and between them they lifted the hatch and shone a torch into the crawl space below, and spent 10 minutes down there while I stood in the hallway doorway and listened to their footsteps on the dirt below my floor. Ferdinand came back up first. His expression was composed, in the way of someone who has decided on composure as a policy. He told me the crawl space ran the full footprint of the apartment, approximately 8 feet deep, accessed by the hatch, with a secondary point at the far end that connected to the building's shared basement. He said it was structurally sound, no water damage, no pests. Then Dimitro came up. He didn't say anything. He handed Ferdinand the torch and looked at me briefly and looked away. And in that brief look was the specific quality of a man who had seen something he was not going to mention in front of his employer. Ferdinand told me he'd have the hatch sealed. He said it as though this solved something. I thanked him, and they left, and I stood in my hallway looking at the closed hatch and thinking about the look on Dimitro's face. I knocked on Dimitro's door in the basement that evening. He lived in the building's ground-level unit, a practical arrangement that came with his super duties. He answered in a kitchen apron, which meant I'd interrupted dinner, and his expression when he saw me was not surprised. He stepped into the hallway and pulled his door to behind him. "What did you see down there?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor. Dimitri was a man who chose his words with the care of someone for whom each one had been individually acquired, and I'd learned to wait for him. "There was a space," he said, "at the far end, near the connection to the main basement." He paused. Someone had been there. Recently, there was a place where someone had been sitting or sleeping. Ground was compressed. There were things. He seemed to look for the word. Belongings. Not many. A blanket, a bottle of water, a small light. I stood in the basement hallway and felt the floor seem to shift slightly beneath me. Not literally. My building's foundation was sound. Ferdinand had said so. But in the way floors shift when the thing you've been standing on turns out to be different from what you thought it was. "How recently?" I managed. He met my eyes. "The water bottle was not empty," he said. I thought about that. About a blanket and a water bottle and a small light in the compressed dark beneath my floorboards. About someone lying in the dirt 8 feet below my hallway while I walked over them on my way to bed. About the hatch flipped and the scratches fresh, and whoever had been down there knowing, having demonstrated the knowledge, that the rug would cover what they'd disturbed when they left. "He took the things with him?" I asked. Assuming a him without examining the assumption, which I've thought about since, Dimitro nodded. Ferdinand didn't see. I moved them before he looked. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because Ferdinand would have sealed the hatch and told you it was fine, he said. And it is not fine. He went back inside. I stood in the basement hallway for a long time after his door closed, listening to the building around me. The pipes, the distant sound of a television from somewhere above, the low hum of the boiler, and thinking about all the sounds a building makes that you learn to stop hearing, and wondering which of them, in 2 years of living here, had not been the building at all. I didn't sleep in the apartment that night. I called my friend Joel and told him I needed his couch, and he said yes in the uncomplicated way of someone who understands that when a person calls at 9 p.m. asking for a couch, the details can wait until morning. I packed a bag in 4 minutes, the focused, automatic packing of someone who has decided that speed matters more than thoroughness, and I locked my apartment and went downstairs and paused at Dimitro's door. I slid a note under it, just my cell number and the words, "If you see anything, please call me. Anytime." I don't know if he ever did. That's a thread I never got to the end of. At Joel's, I sat at his kitchen table and told him everything while he made tea with the serious, quiet efficiency of a man who responds to alarming information by doing something useful with his hands. He listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be and which I have always been grateful to him for. When I finished, he asked 2 questions. The first was whether I was certain about the water bottle, whether Dimitro had been certain. I said yes. The second question was whether anyone other than Ferdinand had a key to my unit. I had given that almost no thought until he asked it. The answer, as far as I knew, was no. My landlord, myself, and a spare I kept at my mother's 3 states away. But keys to the unit and access to the crawl space were not the same thing if the crawl space connected to the building's shared basement. The basement had its own access. The basement was not my unit. In the morning, I went back to the building. Not to my apartment, to the basement, where the secondary access point from the crawl space emerged. Dimitro showed me. It was a low door in the rear wall of the basement storage area, partially obscured behind a shelving unit that held the building's spare maintenance supplies, light bulbs, pipe fittings, cleaning equipment. The door was unlocked. It had no lock at all, just a simple latch on the basement side, the kind of hardware that had been there since 1931 and had never been upgraded because nobody had thought to. Anyone with access to the building's basement could access the crawl space beneath my apartment. And the building's basement had a ground-level exterior door that I now noticed, for the first time in 2 years of living here, had a standard pin-tumbler lock of the kind that a competent person could pick in under a minute. I stood in the basement with this information and felt 2 years of my life reorganize themselves around it. 2 years of evenings, nights, weekends spent in the apartment above this space. Every night I had walked that hallway to bed. Every morning I had walked it back. The rug and its pattern and the rubber backing that I'd never thought to look under because why would you? Why would anyone? I called the police from the basement. Different officers from the last time I'd called anyone. New city, new apartment. This was the first time I'd needed them here, and I was aware as I made the call that I was doing it properly this time, not waiting, not investigating until the evidence became undeniable. A blanket, a water bottle, a compressed area of earth beneath my floor. That was enough. That had to be enough. They came. They were thorough. They photographed the secondary access door, the latch, the shelving unit that had been concealing it. They went into the crawl space themselves and confirmed what Dimitro had described. The compressed area, the evidence of occupation, the belongings now gone. They took a statement from me and a separate one from Dimitro, who answered their questions with the careful precision of a man who had decided to tell the truth fully now that the decision had been taken out of his hands. The lead detective, a woman named Forsyth, 40s, with the particular economy of movement of someone who had been doing this long enough to have eliminated all unnecessary gesture, asked me whether I had noticed anything unusual in the 2 years I'd lived in the apartment. Sounds, disturbances, anything that had seemed unexplained at the time. I thought about it seriously. Really thought, in the way you think when you know the answer matters. I went back through 2 years of evenings and mornings and nights and looked for the things I'd attributed to the building. The groans and the settlings, the sounds that old buildings make as a matter of course, the acoustic texture of a 1931 structure full of pipes and original timber. There was one thing. About 8 months in, the previous October, I had started hearing occasionally a sound I'd located somewhere beneath the hallway floor. A soft, intermittent sound I had identified as the building's plumbing. Irregular water movement, I'd told myself. Old pipes. I had heard it perhaps once a week for several months, and then it had stopped, and I had forgotten about it entirely until Detective Forsyth asked her question. It had not been the plumbing. I understood that now with a cold, total certainty. It had been someone beneath my floor, moving, adjusting, going still when I went still above them, listening to me, listening to them, and letting me believe I was listening to pipes. Forsyth noted it in her file. She told me the investigation was active, that they'd be reviewing basement access records and checking for similar reports in the building's history. She told me not to stay in the apartment until further notice and provided the name of a victim's advocacy contact if I needed support. I asked her the question I'd been building toward for 24 hours. Whether this was a single individual who had recently discovered the space or whether there was evidence of longer-term occupation. She looked at me steadily for a moment, in the way of someone deciding how much the person in front of them can usefully hear. The compressed area in the soil, she said carefully, was not recent. The extent of the compaction was consistent with repeated use over a significant period. She paused. We're not yet able to say how long. I looked at her. We'll know more when the lab results come back, she said. And that was all she said. I walked out of the building into the March afternoon and stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the second-floor window of my apartment. My apartment. The one I'd made mine with a Killam rug carried home in the rain, and thought about the word significant. Significant period. I'd lived there for 2 years. I'd moved in with a rug under my arm and unrolled it in the hallway and never once looked at the floor beneath it. And before me had been another tenant, and before them another, and the hatch had been there since 1931, and the latch on the basement door had never been upgraded, and the shelving unit had been in front of the access door long enough to collect its own undisturbed layer of dust on every surface except the front edge. Except the front edge, which was clean, which had been touched recently and regularly, and often enough that the dust had never been given the chance to settle. I thought about significant, and I could not make it small enough to carry. I stayed at Joel's for a week. He gave me his spare room without ceremony and asked no questions about the timeline, and made coffee every morning in quantities sufficient for 2 people without being asked, which is the specific language of a friend who understands that what you need right now is not conversation, but company. I worked remotely from his kitchen table. I answered emails. I did the ordinary things that ordinary days require, and I did them with the surface of my attention while everything underneath ran its own continuous loop. The compressed soil, the clean front edge of the shelving unit, the sound I'd heard beneath my hallway floor for 3 months and called plumbing. Detective Forsyth called on the 5th day. She had found something. She didn't give me everything on the phone. She asked me to come in, which told me the something was substantial enough to warrant a room and a chair and the particular care that in-person delivery requires. I went that afternoon. Joel drove me and waited in the lobby, which I will always be grateful for. Forsyth's office was small and orderly. She had a folder on the desk, and she opened it with the deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed the order of information. She told me they had identified the individual who had been occupying the crawl space. A man. She gave me his name, and I'm not going to put it here, not because it isn't real, but because I have made a considered decision to own as few pieces of him as possible. He was 43 years old. He had a record, nothing violent in the formal legal sense, but a documented history of stalking behavior across 2 previous incidents in different cities, both of which had resulted in restraining orders that had lapsed or been imperfectly enforced. He was currently unlocated. They were looking. Then she told me the second thing. The lab results from the crawlspace soil had come back. The compaction analysis, the forensic assessment of how long the compressed area had been in use, indicated repeated occupation over a period of between 18 months and 2 years. The physical evidence was consistent, she said carefully, with regular use beginning shortly after the current tenancy started. Shortly after I moved in, he had been there, beneath my floor, for approximately as long as I had been above it. I sat in Forsyth's office and received that information and felt something I can only describe as a reorganization. The whole architecture of the past 2 years shifting on its foundations, every evening and night and morning reassembling itself around a fact that had been true the entire time, and that I had been walking over, literally, every day without knowing. The rug carried home in the rain. The first night in the new apartment, every Thursday, every Sunday, every ordinary Tuesday evening that I had come through my front door and walked the hallway to the kitchen without once looking at the floor beneath my feet. 2 years. He knew the building, Forsyth said. She was watching me carefully in the way of someone monitoring how a person is absorbing something. Previous tenants, we believe, were still establishing the full history, but the evidence suggests familiarity with a space that predates your tenancy. She paused. He knew about the hatch. He knew about the basement access. He knew to keep the rug over it. I looked at her. He flipped the rug, I said. When he left that Tuesday, he flipped it to cover the hatch, but got the pattern wrong. That's how I found it. She nodded. We believe so. An error of orientation. The kind of small mistake that occurs when a routine has been maintained for a long time and complacency sets in. Complacency. He had been beneath my floor long enough to become complacent. Long enough that the routine of covering the hatch had become automatic. Flip, replace, pattern up. And one time, after 2 years of doing it correctly, he had done it wrong, and I'd come home and found my rug face down and crouched in my hallway, and found the pull ring and asked a question whose answer had reorganized everything. I asked Forsyth how he'd managed 2 years without my knowing. Practically. Food, bathroom, movement. She answered with the measured pragmatism of someone who had thought through the operational reality of something obscene. He had access to the building's basement, and from there to the street during hours I was asleep or at work. The crawl space was ventilated through the building's existing ductwork. The water bottle I'd heard about from Dimitro had not been the first. He'd been supplying himself for 2 years through the same access route with the same careful timing, and the sounds I had heard. She confirmed what I had already understood. The plumbing sounds from October of the first year, the intermittent, soft movements I'd located somewhere beneath the hallway. She said they had established from the soil record that those months had been a period of more frequent occupation. She did not speculate about why. I didn't ask her to. I drove back to Joel's in a rideshare alone because I'd told him not to wait, and I sat in the back seat with my hands in my lap and looked out at the city going past, and tried to locate some emotion that was appropriate to the scale of what I'd just been told, and found that the scale was too large for any single emotion to cover. It wasn't fear. Fear is acute, and this was not acute. It was vast and retrospective. It wasn't anger, though the anger was there and would arrive more fully later. It was something closer to vertigo. The specific dizziness of finding out that the ground you have been standing on is not what you believed it to be, and reconstructing your balance from the beginning. I had never been alone in that apartment. Not once. Not a single night in 2 years. Every time I had believed myself to be alone, I had been wrong. And I had been wrong in the most intimate possible ways. Getting dressed, sleeping, being ill, crying after bad days, making dinner for one and eating it on the couch in my pajamas in the private ease of a woman who believed herself to be entirely unobserved in her own home. 2 years of that. 2 years of a life lived in the honest, unguarded way you only live when you believe no one is watching. Someone had been watching, from 8 feet below. Through floorboards and plaster and the ordinary fabric of a domestic life that had never, for a single day of its duration, actually belonged only to me. I sat in the back of the ride chair as the city moved past the window, and I thought about the Killam rug, burnt orange and navy, that I had carried home in the rain. And I thought, I will never own a rug again. And I knew that was not rational, and I did not care. They found him 6 weeks later. I won't say where. I've made the decision to keep the geography of his capture out of this account, the same way I've kept his name out of it. Because the fewer coordinates I provide between myself and that part of the story, the better I sleep. Forsyth called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me they had him in custody, and that I would be contacted by the prosecutor's office about next steps. She said it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been carrying an open case and was setting it down. I thanked her and sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after she hung up. The relief I expected didn't arrive in the form I expected it. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the simple release of a door unlocking. It was more like the first deep breath after a long illness, improvement that you recognize intellectually before your body has caught up. He was in custody. He had been found. The ground had not changed. The 2 years had not changed. The inventory of everything he had witnessed from beneath my floor had not changed. But the forward-facing threat was closed, and that mattered, and I let it matter without demanding that it matter more than it did. I saw a therapist. I want to say that plainly because I think it's the most important, practical thing in this account, and the thing most likely to be useful to anyone reading it. Not immediately. It took me 3 weeks after moving out to make the call. 3 weeks of Joel's couch and then a sublet, and the grinding administrative work of extracting my life from an apartment I was never going back to. But I made the call, and I kept the appointments, and I have kept them now for 7 months, and the work has been slow and non-linear and worth every difficult session. My therapist's name is Dr. Mwangi, and she is precise and warm in equal measure. And she introduced me to a concept I have returned to many times since. The idea that trauma of this specific kind, the violation of domestic privacy over a sustained period, produces a particular injury to what she called the safe base, the internal sense that there is a space in the world that belongs entirely to you, that registers your presence and no one else's, that you can move through with your guard lowered. I had built that safe base in the apartment on Harwick Street, and it had been false from almost the first day, and my nervous system, she said, had known something was wrong, even when my conscious mind had accepted the plumbing explanation and moved on. I thought about the October sounds, the 3 months of soft, intermittent movement I'd heard beneath the hallway floor. My nervous system registering something, and my conscious mind overruling it in the specific way women are trained from childhood to overrule it, to categorize the instinct as paranoia, to find the reasonable explanation, to be polite and quiet and not make a fuss about something that was probably nothing. It was not nothing. It was never nothing. I have a new apartment now. Ground floor was not an option. I understand that's impractical for many people, but it was not an option for me, and I have stopped apologizing internally for that. I am on the 3rd floor of a building constructed in 2008, poured concrete subfloor, no crawl space, no original 1931 timber, no hatch of any kind. I walked the full perimeter of the unit with the building manager before I signed the lease, and I asked questions that made him look at me with the slightly uncertain expression of someone encountering a thoroughness they hadn't anticipated. I don't care about the expression. I asked the question. I have rugs. I want to be clear about that. I have 2 rugs in the new apartment, and I know what is under both of them because I have looked. And what is under both of them is the poured concrete subfloor and nothing else. The Killam runner I left in the Harwick Street apartment when I cleared my things. I did not want it back, and I did not feel guilty about not wanting it. Some objects become permanently attached to the worst thing that happened near them, and you are allowed to leave those objects behind. The things I check now are different from the things I used to check. I used to check locks, windows, the standard perimeter of a woman living alone running her standard inventory. I still check those, but I also check the things that were always there and that I never thought to look at. The floor, the walls, the accessible points I had assumed were inaccessible because no one had told me otherwise. I look at buildings differently now. I understand them as structures with histories that predate my knowledge of them, with features that were built for purposes I may not be aware of, with access points that may have been known to people who are no longer supposed to be there. That sounds like paranoia written down. I know it does. Dr. Mwangi and I have talked about the line between reasonable vigilance and anxiety that limits rather than protects, and I try to walk that line thoughtfully. Most days I manage it. Some days the line is harder to find. The man who lived beneath my floor is awaiting trial. The prosecutor's office has been in contact. There will be a process, and I will be part of it, and I am preparing for that in the ways available to me. Forsyth told me there is evidence from the earlier incidents in other cities, documentation of the pattern, which is both useful and devastating in equal measure. A pattern means this was practiced. A pattern means the 2 years beneath my floor were not his first attempt at this particular form of proximity. I think about the other women, the ones in the other cities, the ones whose buildings had different layouts and different access points, and who may have heard sounds they explained away, or felt the specific unease of a domestic space that registered wrong and found no evidence to justify the feeling. I think about them often. I hope they are talking to someone. I hope they found their way to a 3rd floor with a concrete subfloor and a building manager who looked at them a little strangely when they asked too many questions. I hope they asked the questions. The last thing I want to say is about the rug. About the moment I found it face down in my hallway and felt the wrongness of it before I had the vocabulary to explain why. That moment mattered. That moment and the decision to crouch down in my hallway and look at the floor with a phone torch rather than flip the rug back and accept the most comfortable available explanation. That decision was not nothing either. It was the thing that ended 2 years of a situation that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. I've thought about that many times, about how close I came to flipping it back and going to the kitchen and making dinner and filing the turned rug under buildings are old and things shift, and never looking any further. I didn't do that. I looked. Trust the wrongness. When something in your home presents itself as incorrect, when the grammar of your own space breaks in a way that doesn't resolve into a comfortable explanation, look at it. Look at it directly and without apology, and follow what you find for as long as it takes to find the end of it. The end of it might be pipes. The end of it might be nothing. But sometimes the end of it is a pull ring set flush in a floor you've been walking over for 2 years. And what you do with that pull ring matters more than I can tell you.